They say a king never bleeds. They lied. Vaelor Draven has ruled 3 continents, buried 4 assassination attempts, and broken armies with nothing but silence and the look in his eyes. Tonight, a blade found the one gap in his armor, and the only thing standing between him and death is a woman who shouldn't exist. A woman whose kind his empire erased from history. She's kneeling over him right now, light pouring from her hands, and every instinct his wolf has ever owned is screaming one word. Mine. If you're watching this from your city tonight, drop it in the comments. Let me know where my people are at. Hit that like button and stay with me. This story is just getting started. The blood pooled in the grooves between the obsidian floor tiles, black as ink under torchlight, spreading in slow, deliberate fingers toward the drain at the center of the throne room. Vaelor Draven lay on his back, one hand pressed to his side, the other palm flat against the cold stone, and he did what kings are never supposed to do in front of witnesses. He tried very hard not to die. The assassin was already dead. That part had taken 11 seconds. Vaelor knew because he counted, habit carved into him during the Purging Wars when seconds were the only currency that mattered. The man had come through the Eastern Servant's Passage, good intelligence, clean execution up until the moment Vaelor had turned at the wrong time and the blade hit 2 inches higher than intended. It missed the kill zone. It did not miss him. Around him, his personal guard stood in a tight perimeter, swords drawn, faces blank with professional discipline that couldn't quite hide the tension in their jaws. General Aldrich Thorne stood nearest, a wall of scarred muscle and gray-streaked armor, and even Thorne, who had watched Vaelor walk through burning cities without flinching, was working his jaw like a man grinding down fear into something more useful. "Get the palace healer," Thorne said to nobody in particular. His voice came out low and clipped, the way soldiers talk when they're deciding how scared to be. "Done," said Captain Renavos from somewhere behind him. "Sent runners. 4 minutes." Vaelor exhaled through his teeth. 4 minutes is generous, Captain. "My king." "I'm not requesting reassurance, Renna. I'm managing expectations." He shifted his weight, pressure against the wound, and the pain was honest and specific. Nothing theatrical about it, just a deep grinding pull beneath his ribs that promised worse if he moved wrong. His wolf was not panicking. That surprised him faintly. The animal in him was instead very, very still, the way predators go still when something in the environment changes before the conscious mind registers why. Then he heard her. Not words. Sound. A breath pulled in hard like someone startled, followed by the specific silence of a person deciding whether to move or stay hidden. The gallery above the throne room, eastern alcove behind the ceremonial banners. Everyone in his guard was looking at the doors. Nobody was looking up. Vaelor turned his head 45 degrees and found her in the shadows. She was pressed against the stone pillar with the careful stillness of someone who'd had practice disappearing into rooms. Young, late 20s maybe, though the set of her jaw suggested she'd earned more years than she'd actually lived. Dark hair pulled back without ceremony, plain traveling clothes that had seen better roads, a leather satchel worn crossbody that she was gripping with both hands like it might run away from her. Her eyes, even from this distance, even in torchlight, were the specific shade of amber that old text described as a marker of certain bloodlines the Empire had classified as extinct. She was staring at the wound in his side, and there was light coming from her hands. Not torch glow, not reflection. A deep internal luminescence, soft gold threaded with white, pressing through her fingers like something alive trying to get out. Her knuckles had gone tight around the satchel strap, and the light was reacting to that, pulsing slightly when her grip tightened, and she looked terrified in the specific way of a person whose body is doing something their mind has spent years trying to make it stop. Vaelor stared at her for 3 full seconds. His wolf stopped being still. "Guards," he said, his voice carrying no particular urgency. "We have a visitor in the gallery." The room moved fast. Swords, boots, shouted commands in Aldrich's graveled bark. Vaelor watched her calculate escape in real time. He could see it, the micro shift of weight toward the far end of the gallery, the assessment of distance. And he watched her decide against it. Not because she couldn't, because she was still looking at him. At the blood. She came down from the gallery the way someone descends stairs when they know it's a bad idea, and they're going to do it anyway, step by deliberate step, the light in her hands intensifying as she moved closer, and the satchel swinging with the gait of someone carrying a heavy conscience. 4 of his guard intercepted her before she reached the bottom. She stopped, surrounded, and did not raise her hands, and the light kept doing what the light was doing regardless of whether she wanted it to. "Don't touch me," she said. Flat. No plea in it, just information. "On your knees," Thorn said. "If I go to my knees, your king bleeds out before your healer gets here." She looked past the general directly at Vaelor with an expression he didn't entirely have language for. Not defiance exactly, more like someone delivering news they know will be poorly received. The blade nicked a branch of the deep vessel. "You have less time than you think. Let me work or don't, but decide now, because once that vessel closes around the damage, I can't open it clean without killing you myself." The throne room was extremely quiet. Thorn's hand went to his sword. "How does she know it?" "Because she can see it," Vaelor said. He'd read descriptions. Fragments of text the palace archivists cataloged before the Purging Wars scrubbed the libraries clean, theological authorities declaring the material dangerous, and the originals were burned, but someone, careful, frightened, determined, had copied passages into the margins of agricultural records and trade logs where they hoped nobody would think to look. He'd found them as a younger man, reading through boredom turned to obsession. And the descriptions had used words like illumination of the interior and sight beyond the surface and the healer who reads blood as others read text. He thought it was poetry. He looked at the light coming from her hands and revised his opinion. "Let her through," he said. "My king!" Thorn's voice had gone hard. "We don't know who she—" "Aldrich." He kept his voice even, which cost him something because the grinding in his side was escalating and he was becoming aware of the particular cold that starts at the extremities when a body is beginning to have opinions about its own continued operation. "If she wanted me dead, she had a better angle from the gallery. Let her through." Thorn stepped aside. The look on his face would have to be dealt with later. She crossed the distance between them and knelt beside him without ceremony, and the moment her hands came close to his side, the light changed. Brighter, more purposeful. She wasn't guiding it exactly. It was more like she was stopping herself from blocking it, an act of deliberate restraint. And up close he could see the strain of that in the tension around her eyes, and the way her jaw was set. "This is going to feel strange," she said. "I've been stabbed. Define strange. Like something moving inside your chest that shouldn't be moving." She met his eyes briefly. Hers were, in fact, amber, the precise historical shade. "If you panic, it gets worse." "I don't panic," he said, which was mostly true. She pressed her palms flat against his side without touching the wound directly, and the light went in. He'd been wrong about it feeling strange. Strange was the wrong word entirely. It felt like a hand reaching into the machinery of him and finding the broken gear and holding it still, not repairing it yet, just containing the damage with a precision that was almost worse than the pain, because the precision implied understanding of his interior that no person should have. He felt the torn tissue. He felt the blood finding the correct channel again. He felt the vessel wall close by increments, deliberate and careful as fine stitching, and the grinding that had been promising catastrophe wound down to something he could breathe through. The entire process took perhaps 4 minutes. She sat back on her heels when it was done and flexed her fingers once, looking at her own hands with an expression he couldn't read. The light faded. Her face was pale, faintly sheened with the specific effort sweat that comes from using a muscle past where it's comfortable, and she exhaled through her nose and looked away from him like she'd just done something she was deciding whether to regret. "That'll hold until a conventional healer can reinforce it," she said. "Don't spar. Don't ride hard. Give it a week." "Who are you?" Vaelor said. Not a question particularly. "No one." She started to stand. His hand came down on her wrist before he'd consciously decided to move. The grip wasn't cruel, but it was absolute, and she froze in the crouch halfway up and went very carefully still in the manner of someone who knows that sudden movement is a worse option. "Who are you?" he said again, same flat register, and this time the absence of interrogative inflection made it something else entirely. Her pulse was fast under his thumb. Her jaw tightened. "I told you, no one. You have Lumi-born hands." His voice was low. Not threatening, factual in the way that facts can be more threatening than any raised tone. "That light doesn't come from no one. That sight doesn't come from no one. I've read 3 centuries of records on what your people could do, and every one of those records said the last of your bloodline died in the Veldris Purge 18 years ago. He didn't release her wrist. So I'll ask you once more, and I'd like to be done with this particular question before my general decides to make a decision. I'd have to countermand. Thorn had moved closer. His hand was on his sword. She looked at Vaelor's hand on her wrist. She looked at Thorn. She looked at the doors, which were now held by a wall of his guard, and she made the specific kind of calculation that he recognized because he made them himself, the kind where you're not assessing your odds, but assessing the least bad of the available bad options. Seraphine Vael, she said. The Vael lineage was Lumaborn's secondary line, he said, not core bloodline. Survivable, theoretically, if someone got out before the fires reached Alaris. Her throat moved. Something happened in her expression that she controlled almost immediately, but the almost was visible. I was 8, she said. My mother got us out. Us, he said. A longer pause. She got me out. He released her wrist. He got to his feet, which his side communicated strong objections to, but he did it without showing those objections because there were people watching and the dynamics of this room needed to be established correctly. Seraphine rose the rest of the way, as he did, keeping a careful distance, and he looked at her for a moment with the particular attention he usually reserved for maps of enemy territory. She met his gaze without dropping it. That was interesting. General Thorn, he said. My king. Miss Vael will be given the eastern guest quarters, healer's grade furnishings. He kept watching her face as he said this. She'll be provided a guard for her safety. My king, protocol, he said, requires that I don't let an asset walk back out into the city where whoever sent that assassin tonight might notice her and draw the correct conclusion about what she just did for me. It also requires that I not treat a woman who just saved my life like a prisoner. He paused. Or a threat. She may be both, Thorn said. Most valuable things are. He looked at Seraphine. You're not under arrest. You're under my protection. There's a difference that matters. You'll want to understand it before you decide to argue with me. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds, jaw working slightly, and then, I'd like my satchel returned. You'll have it. Undisturbed. Miss Vael. His voice carried the faint undercurrent of amusement that he used specifically when he wanted someone to understand he was taking them seriously enough to find them slightly entertaining. I've been ruling this empire for 11 years. I know which battles are worth picking. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that suggested she was reserving judgment about what that statement actually meant, and then she turned and let his guard escort her from the room without another word. Thorn waited until the doors closed. She's a liability, he said. She's a miracle, Vaelor said, which was not a word he used under ordinary circumstances. He moved toward the throne, carefully, managing his side. Whether she's also a liability remains to be determined. Loomborn bloodline in the capital. Do you understand what the council will say when... The council, Vaelor said, settling into the throne with the deliberateness of a man installing himself as an unmovable object, will say what the council always says when something disrupts the comfortable world they've built from the ashes of what this empire burned. They'll call it dangerous. They'll call it a threat to stability. They'll quote doctrine and historical precedent, and they'll look at me with those careful faces they use when they're deciding which fear is bigger, the one in front of them or the one I represent. He looked at Aldrich, and then they'll wait to see which way I move, same as they always do. Thorn was quiet for a moment. And which way will you move? Vaelor looked at his own hand, the wrist where he'd gripped hers, the ghost warmth of a pulse still faint against his thumb. I don't know yet, he said, which is interesting. It's been some years since I didn't know. The eastern guest quarters were better than a cell and worse than what Seraphine had been told to expect, which meant someone in the palace hierarchy had compromised between the king's instruction and their own threat assessment and produced a room that was comfortable in the way of a gilded cage that had been recently dusted. She stood in the center of it for a long time after the guard closed the door. The satchel was on the bed, undisturbed, as promised. She opened it anyway, checked the contents by feel more than sight. The glass vials in their padded sleeves, the dried root bundles wrapped in cloth, the journal with its water-warped cover and coded entries. And then she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed. Her hands were shaking, had been shaking since she'd pressed them against his side, and felt the light do what it always did when the need was acute enough to override her suppression of it. Not just illuminate, but open. That specific tearing open feeling of a door she kept locked swinging wide without asking her permission. She'd been in Astrolith for 11 days. She'd come for the archive. The palace archive beneath the Hall of Records, specifically. She had reason to believe certain documents had survived the systematic destruction of Lumeborn history. Not intact, not complete, but enough. Enough to confirm what she'd spent the last 4 years piecing together from fragments and surviving witnesses, and the specific silences in official imperial histories where things that happened had been carefully deleted from the record. She had not come to save the king. She had not come to be noticed. She had not come to use her hands where anyone could see, and the fact that she had anyway, the fact that she'd come down from that gallery when the rational choice was to stay hidden and let events unfold and protect herself, the fact that she'd looked at the blood spreading across that obsidian floor and felt something in her chest lurch forward without consulting her. She pressed her palms harder against her thighs. He'd recognized it. Not guessed, not suspected. Recognized. That was the part that sat wrong. He'd looked at the light in her hands and he'd said, "Lumeborn the way you say the name of something you've been looking for. The way an archivist says a title he's spent years trying to locate. Not afraid. Not disgusted the way the doctrine keepers phrased it in the old edicts she'd read. Certain, specific. Like a man checking a name off a list. Kings did not read old records about extinct bloodlines for recreation. She wanted to know why he had. She wanted to know several other things too, which was its own kind of problem, because wanting to know things about Vaelor Draven was how you walked off the edge of something that looked like solid ground from a distance. She'd seen him before tonight. Twice. Briefly, in the week she'd spent in the city getting her bearings and her documentation in order. Once at the ceremonial procession on the founding anniversary, he'd ridden through the city on a gray horse that was too old to be decorative, which she'd noted because it was the kind of choice that meant something, riding a familiar animal instead of a young, impressive one. Once through the window of a transit house on the Merchant Road, where she'd seen him in a group of advisors crossing the courtyard below, and what she'd noticed was that he was the one not talking. Everyone else was constructing the conversation, filling the air, performing the management of power. He was the one watching, and she'd had the unsettling sense even from that distance of a man who was always doing arithmetic. In the throne room tonight, bleeding on his back, he'd been doing arithmetic. She'd seen it in his eyes when he'd found her in the gallery. The rapid, silent calculation of what she was, what she meant, what the variables were. She'd watched him decide to let her through in the space of 3 seconds. That was not a king making a fear decision. That was a king making a use decision. And the sophistication of the distinction, the fact that he'd been losing blood and still functioning at that level of analysis, it was admirable. She hated that it was admirable. The knock at her door came just past midnight. Not the guard's courtesy knock, different cadence. She stood before she'd consciously processed why, satchel already in her hand, and then the door opened, and it was not the guard. It was a young woman in palace livery, carrying a tray, with the specific combination of studied neutrality and acute tension that meant she'd been sent by someone of significance and told not to show it. "From the king," the woman said, setting the tray on the side table without making eye contact. "Medical supplies and a meal." She paused at the door. "He also said to tell you, and I'm to pass this exactly, that the Eastern Archive is accessible between the 3rd and 5th hour if someone needed to consult historical records without an official access request." Seraphine looked at the tray, then at the woman. "What's your name?" The woman blinked. "Lyra, miss." "Thank you, Lyra." The woman left. Seraphine stood in the middle of the room and looked at the tray and felt the slow, uncomfortable arrival of an emotion she didn't want, because she knew what it was, the recognition that someone had paid attention to what she actually needed, which was harder to defend against than force. She ate. She was angrier about that than she expected. The archive was real. She'd suspected it might be. The rumor was old and specific enough to carry the weight of true things, the way lies tend to flatten over time while truth develops texture. But suspicion and confirmation are different animals, and standing in the low-ceilinged chamber beneath the Hall of Records at the 4th hour, surrounded by stone shelving that went back 300 years. She felt the specific vertigo of a person for whom a door they've been pressing against for a long time has just opened. The materials from the Loomborn period were not displayed. They were not cataloged in the main indices. They were in a separate section behind a locked gate, and the key had been on the tray with the meal, tied to a piece of cord with no explanation. She worked for 2 hours. The documents were fragmentary, some badly damaged, some in dialects she could only approximate. But the records she needed were there. The land grants, the treaty documents, the pre-purge correspondence between Lumeborn Council elders and the imperial throne. The evidence she'd been assembling for 4 years, that the territories claimed by the Empire during the Purging Wars had not been empty land abandoned by a dangerous fringe, but populated, documented, deliberately targeted. She didn't have it in her hands exactly, but she had the shape of it, the gaps where things should be, as telling as anything that remained. She also found something she hadn't expected, a record of a commission, dated 14 years ago, bearing the seal of a Draven ancestor. A private commission from the royal house to a historical research agency she didn't recognize, requesting a comprehensive accounting of Lumeborn bloodline survivability post-purge. The document was requesting information about survivors. She stared at it for a long time. It wasn't the king she'd grown up hating. It predated Vaelor Draven's reign by several years, but someone in his bloodline had been looking. She didn't know what to do with that. She took the document anyway, tucking it into her journal with hands that had stopped shaking sometime in the last few hours, and were now doing something she liked less, moving with the steadiness of a person who has made a decision they haven't consciously acknowledged yet. She found him in the war room at the 5th hour, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected to return the key and find an empty archive. The war room was lit by a dozen candles arranged with the pragmatic economy of a man who needed to see maps clearly and didn't care much about atmosphere. 3 large tables bore territorial maps covered in weighted markers. The walls held tactical diagrams and what appeared to be supply route analyses. He was at the central table, alone, jacket removed, studying something with the focus of a man working a problem that wouldn't let him sleep. He looked up when she entered. She'd taken care with her approach, quiet, careful, and he'd heard her anyway, or perhaps felt her the way she'd been aware of something slightly wrong about the ambient energy of the room the moment she'd opened the door, some specific tension that hadn't been there in the archive and was here now, centered on him. She put the key on the edge of the nearest table. "Thank you," she said, which cost her something. He looked at the key, then at her. He hadn't bothered with a formal posture. "Did you find what you needed?" "Some of it." She kept her distance. The room was not large. "I found a commission document, your family's seal, 14 years ago. Someone was looking for survivors." Something moved in his expression that she couldn't fully decipher. "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the map in front of him, and something about the look was not strategic. It was the look of a man deciding how much truth to use. "My grandmother," he said, "she was not part of the decisions that were made during the purge. She was a child when they happened, but she understood what they were." He turned the marker in his fingers, a short, careful motion. She spent the last decade of her life trying to locate survivors. She had reason to believe, that the official record of the bloodline's extinction was partly constructed, that people survived who were documented as dead. "To protect them," Seraphine said, "or to give the Empire an excuse to stop looking." His voice was even. "I've never been certain which." "And the commission went nowhere." "The commission found fragments, possibilities, nothing that led anywhere conclusive before she died." He set the marker down. "I inherited the research 8 years ago, continued it informally, through channels that wouldn't generate official documentation. She was doing arithmetic of her own now, the uncomfortable kind where the numbers don't produce the answer you were prepared for. You knew there might be survivors. I believed there might be. And tonight? Tonight I knew," he said, simply, not triumphant, not claiming anything, just the fact of it. The candlelight moved. Somewhere in the palace, the night guard changed shifts. She could hear the distant protocol of it, formal and rhythmic. "That doesn't change what happened," she said, "what your empire did." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She hadn't expected him to not argue that. The absence of argument sat between them like a third thing, not comfortable but not hostile either. It was the kind of quiet that meant something. "I want access to the full archive," she said. "Not the public section, the classified materials from the Purge period, the original documentation, whatever survived." He looked at her for a long moment. "What are you building?" "A record." She met his eyes. "A complete one. Because yours was never complete. Because the account this empire tells of what happened is a lie, dressed up in official language and stamped with authority seals. And every generation that inherits that lie instead of the truth inherits a debt they don't know they're carrying." The silence stretched. "There are people on my council," he said carefully, "who would view that record as a direct threat to imperial legitimacy. I know. Who would view you as a threat? I know that too. And you're asking me to give you the tools to build something that could destabilize everything I've spent 11 years managing." His voice held no anger, just the arithmetic. "I'm asking you to let the truth exist," she said. "Whatever you do with it after that is your problem. But I want the record complete. I want it to exist somewhere." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the tall, narrow windows, the sky was beginning its slow shift from black toward the deep gray that comes before actual light. She could see the city below, still dark, still sleeping, the lights of night patrols moving at the edges. "I'll arrange full archive access," he said. "You'll have a research designation that gives you legitimate cover. The guard assigned to your quarters will be discreet. He's been with me for 12 years. If you need to move through the palace for research purposes, he'll facilitate it." He paused. "In exchange, I want to understand what you know, not as a threat to it, not to control it. I want to understand the shape of the history my family helped erase." She looked at him for a long time, this man who was the crown of the thing that had destroyed her world, offering her a key and asking for a mirror. "That's a strange thing for a king to ask for," she said. "I'm aware." He held her gaze. "There's a council meeting in 4 days. Your presence will be noted. I need to make decisions about how to present your situation before then." He paused again. "I'd find it useful to make those decisions with accurate information about what kind of threat you actually are. Versus the kind you'd fabricate? Versus the kind they'll fabricate on my behalf if I give them enough blank space to fill." His voice was dry, but not unkind. "The council is creative when they're afraid. I prefer to manage the narrative when I still can." She looked at him and felt beneath the accumulated habit of grievance and the entirely legitimate architecture of her mistrust, something more inconvenient. Respect. Specific and reluctant. The kind that doesn't ask your permission before arriving. 4 days, she said. 4 days. She turned to leave. "Miss Vael?" She stopped. "Whatever you find in those archives," he said, "I won't ask you to protect me from it. I'd rather know." She looked back at him over her shoulder, his face half lit by candles. The map spread around him like a second territory he was always navigating, and she thought about what it meant to be the person who inherited a crime and knew it and stayed anyway, which was its own kind of ruin. "Then you're either brave or a fool," she said. "Most days," he said quietly. "I'm not certain which." She left him in the war room with the maps and the candles, and the slow arrival of the morning she wasn't sure either of them was ready for. She found out 2 days later while reading shipping records from the Veldris Purge era what the commission document had been missing. The research Vaelor's grandmother had commissioned had found survivors, 3 of them. The report was buried in the personal correspondence section, sealed and archived under a family designation that would only mean something to someone who knew what to look for. And she knew what to look for because the designation was a Vael family code, her mother's family code, which meant the researcher had found someone who could confirm the identities, and that someone had given them the code. And the code led to a document that the palace had held for 11 years that listed 3 surviving members of Lumaborn bloodlines. Her name was there, and below it, marked with a notation that read, "Location unconfirmed, believed deceased," was a name she hadn't spoken aloud in 4 years. Hadn't let herself think about directly, had kept in a locked room in herself alongside other things she couldn't afford to open. Calum Vael, her brother. The palace had known he existed for 11 years and had not searched for him, which meant either they believed the notation and stopped looking, or they had found him and the information was somewhere else. She sat with the document in her hands and felt the cold, specific arrival of the kind of fear that isn't about yourself. She was already moving toward the door when the explosion hit, not in the archive. Somewhere above, somewhere in the palace proper, a concussive thud that traveled through the stone like a heartbeat, and then the sound of running, and then shouting in the rapid, flat cadence of soldiers responding to something that wasn't supposed to happen. She took the stairs two at a time, satchel over her shoulder, and pushed through the archive entrance into the Hall of Records corridor to find it full of smoke and guards moving in tight formation toward the palace's central wing. Her assigned guard, Edron, 12 years with the king, discreet as promised, appeared from nowhere at her shoulder. "Stay close." "What happened?" "Messenger bird came in. Imperial seal. When they opened the message container, He broke off. "Incendiary device. Small one. Enough to send a message." His jaw was tight. 3 staff injured. The message itself survived. "What did it say?" Edron looked at her with the expression of a man deciding what he was cleared to share. "It said," he told her slowly, "that the last Lumaborn has been seen in Astrolith, and that whoever is sheltering her has 7 days to hand her over." He paused. "Or the capital will learn what it means to burn." The smoke in the corridor moved through a shaft of morning light coming through a high window. She felt the document in her satchel like something alive. She knew, with the cold certainty of someone who has spent years learning to recognize the handwriting of a life they'd thought buried, exactly who had sent that message. And she knew what it meant. He hadn't died. He hadn't been saved either. 7 days. The smoke hadn't cleared yet when Vaelor found her. He came through the corridor with Thorn at his shoulder and 4 guards flanking them, and the first thing he registered was that she was standing in the middle of the Hall of Records passage, with her satchel over her shoulder and the specific stillness of a person absorbing something catastrophic and deciding what shape to put it in. Not panicked, not running. Still, in the way of water that has just gone very cold. The second thing he registered was that she already knew, not suspected, knew. He'd been reading people for 11 years from a throne, and the face she was making was not the face of someone receiving news. It was the face of someone watching a door they'd locked for a long time swing open from the other side. "You need to tell me what that message means to you," he said. She looked at him. "I need to know what it said first, all of it." He nodded once at Edron, who repeated it verbatim, the way a man who trained himself to carry messages exactly did. No interpretation, no cushion. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. When she opened them, something had settled in her expression. Not resolution, reckoning. "It's my brother," she said. The corridor went quiet in the specific way it does when the people occupying it suddenly understand that the problem they've been managing has just changed categories. Thorn's voice was flat and precise. "Your brother is dead. The Vael line extinction is documented." "The Vael line extinction," she said, her voice carrying exactly the temperature of controlled anger, "is a document. Documents are written by people. People make choices about what they record." She looked at Vaelor, not Thorn. "The commission record from 14 years ago. I found it in the archive this morning. Your grandmother's researchers found 3 survivors, my name, mine, under a protection alias, and Calum." She paused. "Marked location unconfirmed, believed deceased." Vaelor said nothing for a moment. He was doing the arithmetic again, the rapid internal process of what this meant against what he'd known and what had been withheld from him, and the specific category of anger that came from discovering that incomplete information had been passed to him as complete. "That notation," he said carefully, "was not in the copy of the commission summary I received." "No," she said, "it wasn't." The implication landed between them without either of them needing to state it out loud. Someone had edited the summary before it reached him. Someone with access to the records and a reason to ensure that Calum Vael's potential survival remained a matter of private knowledge. Thorn crossed his arms. His voice dropped to operational. "If the sender of that message is actually a surviving Lumaborn, then we're not dealing with a standard insurgent. We're dealing with someone who has access to abilities the Empire classified as existential threats in the original Purge Doctrine." "The Purge Doctrine," Seraphine said, "classified midwives and farmers as existential threats. I'd be careful about using it as a threat assessment framework. I'd be careful, Thorn said, about the tone you take in this corridor. Aldrich. Vaelor's voice was quiet. Quiet in the specific way that ended sentences. Thorn shut his mouth. His jaw moved once, grinding down what remained. Vaelor looked at Seraphine. Come with me. The private study was small by palace standards. Intentionally so, he'd always thought. His father had preferred the grand reception rooms, the high ceilings and 40-foot walls that communicated power through scale. Vaelor had done most of the actual work of governing in a room with a low ceiling and bookshelves on 3 walls, and a desk that was scarred from decades of use, because power communicated through furniture had always struck him as a concession to insecurity. He closed the door. Thorn remained outside, by choice on both sides, the general's disapproval finding its expression in the deliberate absence of himself. Seraphine sat in the chair across from the desk without being invited to, which he noted without objecting to. She set the satchel on her knees and kept both hands visible on its strap, not guarded exactly, more like someone anchoring themselves. Tell me about him, Vaelor said. She looked at the bookshelves for a moment, not avoiding, thinking, deciding where to begin with something that doesn't have a clean beginning. He was 6 when we ran, she said. I was 8. Our mother got us out of Ilaris before the fires reached the lower sanctuary. We had 4 days of running before the Imperial trackers found us. She paused. My mother hid us in a supply wagon headed for the eastern border. She didn't get in the wagon herself. She said this the way people say things they've said many times in their own heads. The words worn smooth from the repetition, all the jagged edges filed down. What remained was the shape of the grief without its surface texture, which was in some ways harder to listen to than screaming. We crossed the border, she said. 3 weeks. A village family took us in. They didn't know what we were. Calum was sick from the journey, and I had to be very careful about what I did to help him, because the village was small, and people noticed things. She looked down at her hands. We were there for almost a year. Then someone came asking about children matching our descriptions. We ran again. She paused. I was 9. He was 7. I made decisions that 9-year-olds should not be making about which roads were safe and which wasn't. Where did you lose him? She looked up. I didn't lose him. He was taken. The correction was not aggressive, just exact. We'd made it to the Veldris coast, 12 years old and 9. We had documentation. False, but good. We were going to take a merchant ship east. Her jaw tightened slightly. There was a sweep, not targeted at us specifically. A general sweep of transit papers in the harbor district. Imperial agents. They were looking for contraband. They found us. She stopped. I got away because a dock worker blocked the path. Deliberately. I don't know why. I never knew his name. Calum was 3 steps behind me, and then he wasn't. The candles on the desk burned in their steady way, indifferent to what was being said around them. I searched for 8 years, she said. Through every contact I could build, every rumor, every name. The official record said he was processed through a detention facility and died of fever within 3 months. Her voice remained level. I didn't believe it then. I believe it even less now. Because someone took the trouble to document it, Vaelor said. She looked at him sharply. He saw in her expression the recognition of a mind she hadn't expected to track that quickly. Official records of deaths in Imperial detention facilities from that period, he said, are notably complete for Loomborn-associated individuals, specifically those whose deaths closed a line of inquiry that someone wanted closed. He paused. I noticed it. In the research. The death records were too clean, too well documented. Most detention deaths from that era have 2-line entries. The Lumiborn-coded deaths have full medical notations. He held her gaze. Someone was building a record, not of deaths, of disappearances they wanted classified as deaths. The room was very quiet. This is what is rarely understood about power. Its most dangerous exercise is not the command given in a loud voice, but the document signed in a quiet room. The notation made in the margin of a record that a person will read years later and accept as truth, because it carries the weight of official certainty. Vaelor Draven had governed long enough to understand that most of what his empire had inherited as fact was actually a series of choices made by specific people in specific moments who had decided that their version of events was the one that deserved to survive. He'd spent years trying to locate the choices beneath the facts. What he'd found, more often than he would have chosen to know, was that the choices were more deliberate and more cruel than the facts implied. There is a particular kind of anger available only to people who have looked at their inheritance clearly. Most people don't. Most people accept the version they were handed and call it history. The ones who look clearly, they have to decide what to do with what they find, and the deciding is not comfortable, and it doesn't end. If your brother is alive, Vaelor said, and if he's been in Imperial detention or worse for how long? He'd be 27 now, she said. 20 years. 20 years. He said the number plainly and let it exist without qualification. 20 years was not a trauma that produced survivors in any conventional sense of the word. 20 years of whatever the detention facilities in the Eastern Territories had involved. And he had read the reports, the actual operational reports, not the sanitized versions. Produced something transformed, not destroyed. Transformed, in the specific way that pressure transforms material, changing its fundamental properties. He won't be who he was, Vaelor said. I know that, she said softly. I know. The message, he started. The message is Calum, she said. The phrasing, the way it's constructed, there's a cadence to it. We grew up speaking a specific dialect of the old Luma-born trade language and even translated it as a... She stopped. It's him, I'm certain. Then he knows you're here. Or he knows someone like me is here, and he's drawing me out. She looked at her hands. Or both. The thing about grief that's been sealed for a long time is that when it breaks containment, it doesn't break cleanly. It comes out hot and cold simultaneously, the old mourning and the new information colliding before the mind can arrange them into something coherent. Seraphine was doing that now. He could see it in the controlled quality of her breathing, the deliberate stillness of her hands. She was holding herself together through sheer mechanical effort and doing it extremely well, but the effort was visible to anyone paying the right kind of attention. He looked away to give her the privacy of it. 7 days, he said to the desk. He's given us 7 days. He's given me 7 days, she said. You're incidental. I'm the thing he's threatening to burn, Vaelor said. I'm less incidental than he'd like. She made a sound that was almost not a laugh. Almost. What do you need? He said. She looked at him. I'm sorry? To find him, to reach him, to understand what he's built and what he wants, and whether there's a path through this that doesn't involve your brother destroying a city of 400,000 people who had nothing to do with what happened to him. He kept his voice even. What do you need that I can give you? She was quiet for a long time. The full archive, she said finally, including the operational records from the Eastern facilities. The actual ones. He nodded. Access to your intelligence network, not summaries. The raw contacts and their current information on whatever he's been involved with. Because if he has an army, someone in your network knows about it and chose not to elevate it. He felt the specific tension of that last clause, but didn't deflect it. She was right. Someone had known and not told him, which was a problem with a short list of suspects that he was already working through. Done, he said. And I want to be in the room when you talk to your council in 2 days, she said, not presented as an asset or a threat or a political problem. Present me as a consultant, someone with direct knowledge of the situation. Thorn was going to have opinions about this. Done, he said again. She looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating their expectations, which he found briefly gratifying and then set aside because gratification was not what this moment required. Why, she said. Why what? Why are you doing this? Not the political calculation. I can work that out myself. Why does it feel like something else? He looked at her for a moment. Because my grandmother spent the last decade of her life trying to do a thing she didn't finish, he said. And I've spent 8 years trying to understand why it mattered enough to her that she kept going after the trail went cold. And I think... He stopped, started again. I think she understood something about what an empire built on a buried crime eventually becomes. The burial doesn't hold. History is not actually manageable. It comes up. He met her eyes. I'd rather be the person who opens the ground than the person standing on top when it opens itself. Dulciban si estan. Seraphine held his gaze for a long moment. That's a decent answer, she said. I don't entirely trust it. You shouldn't, he said. Not yet. She stood, shouldered her satchel, and moved toward the door and then stopped. He was funny, she said. When he was small, he used to name the birds that came to the sanctuary windows. Gave them all extremely serious names. Called a sparrow ambassador. She said this to the bookshelf, not to him. I don't know who he is now. I'm terrified of who he is now. She turned the door handle. But I'm going to find out. And I need you to understand that whatever I find, my first obligation is to him. I understand, Vaelor said. Do you? Your first obligation is your brother, he said. My first obligation is my city. Those don't have to be the same thing to coexist. She looked at him. Something moved in her expression that she didn't completely lock down. She left without answering, which was its own kind of answer. What? The council meeting came in 2 days, as scheduled, and nothing about it was comfortable. The chamber was designed to impose high-backed chairs in a horseshoe formation, the throne at the open end, every sightline engineered so the king looked out and the council looked in, the architecture of decision-making built into the physical geometry of the room. Vaelor had sat in this chamber 200 times. He knew its dynamics the way he knew the weight of his sword. He knew, watching 12 faces arrange themselves into their respective postures as Seraphine entered behind him, that today would be a different kind of session. Lord Councillor Bryn Van Hale spoke first, which was his habit and his strategy. Hale had governed his position on the council by being the person who named things before others could, thereby controlling the initial frame. You've brought a guest, Hale said. His voice was practiced warmth over structural cold. He was 63, silver-haired, and had been on the council through 2 reigns. He was not stupid. None of them were stupid. We weren't informed of a new appointment. Miss Vale is a consultant with direct intelligence on the threat situation, Vaelor said. She's here to provide context. The threat situation, said Councillor Drea Malis from the far end, a woman whose expertise was domestic security, and who had, in Vaelor's experience, the best threat instincts on the council, but also the narrowest definition of what constituted an acceptable response. Being the incendiary device sent to the palace 3 days ago claiming responsibility for threatening the capital. That's correct, Vaelor said. And she's relevant to that situation how, Malis said, looking at Seraphine with the specific quality of assessment that belonged to someone cataloging a room for exits and vulnerabilities. Seraphine spoke before Vaelor could. The sender of that message is my brother, she said. He's a surviving member of the Lumaborn bloodline. He has, I believe, significant capabilities and an organized following with genuine grievances against the Empire. She kept her voice level. Informational. I have knowledge of his background, his likely methods, and the kind of approach that has any chance of resolving this without casualties in the tens of thousands. The council chamber produced several kinds of silence. This one was the kind that happened when people were calculating very fast and trying not to show it. Hale's expression was careful. A loom-born survivor, he said, not to Seraphine, to Vaelor. In the palace. In the palace, Vaelor confirmed. Protected. Protected. Hale looked at Seraphine again, and the look he gave her was not hostile. That was the thing about Hale. He wasn't hostile. He was precisely strategic in a way that made hostility unnecessary. You understand, Miss Vale, that the historical doctrine of this empire, the doctrine responsible for the events you've survived, that doctrine still has significant support among certain institutional frameworks. Certain authorities who would view your presence here, your existence, as a provocation. I've been aware of that since I was 8 years old, she said. The temperature in the room did something specific. Hale folded his hands. What we're being asked to consider, he said, addressing the table, is essentially this. A surviving member of a bloodline this empire has official doctrine classifying as extinguished is now in the palace. Her brother is threatening the capital, and our king is proposing we treat this as a consultancy situation rather than a security situation. I'm proposing, Vaelor said, that we treat this accurately, which is to say, A man with legitimate cause for grievance against specific decisions made by this empire has organized a force capable of threatening the capital. The way to resolve that is not another purge. The way to resolve that is not force first. The way to resolve it, with respect, said Counselor Theus, Military Affairs, young for his position and aggressive in the way of young men who'd earned advancement through technical competence and hadn't yet been made humble by the things technical competence couldn't solve. We've received a direct threat against the capital. The appropriate response is identification, location, and neutralization of the threat. Not, he gestured towards Seraphine in a way that stopped just short of dismissive. This. Define neutralization, Seraphine said. Theus looked at her. You said neutralization, she said. Doris, define it, because that word is doing a lot of work in your sentence, and I'd like to understand specifically what you mean. Standard counterinsurgency protocols. My brother is 27 years old, she said, her voice still even but with something underneath it now. A current. The specific quality of a person who has been patient about something long past the point patience was comfortable. He's been in imperial detention for a substantial portion of those years for the crime of existing. Your neutralization protocols were applied to his entire people 20 years ago, and they produced exactly the situation you're now trying to manage. So I'd like you to be specific about what you mean when you use that word, because I have some relevant data on its outcomes. Theus opened his mouth. Counselor. Vaelor's voice was quiet. Theus closed his mouth. The council chamber settled into the specific silence of a room where power has been exercised at low volume, which is the only kind that actually matters. Here is what happens in the next 7 days, Vaelor said, and his voice carried the flat authority of a man who was done with the framing negotiation and moving to declaration. We locate the sender through Miss Vale's intelligence and my network's existing contacts. We assess the size and nature of what he's organized. We identify the legitimate grievances driving his support base. Because an army that isn't fighting for something doesn't hold together, and understanding what they're fighting for tells us more about resolution paths than any tactical assessment. He looked around the table. And we do not, under any circumstances, do anything in the next 7 days that makes the situation irreversible. We do not move military assets into visible positions around the civilian population. We do not make arrests that signal to his organization that negotiation is off the table. We do not, his gaze landed on Theus, neutralize anything. And if he moves first, Malus said, then we respond, but we don't give him a reason to. Hale was watching Seraphine, not threateningly, with the interest of a man who was revising an assessment. You believe you can reach him, he said. I don't know, she said. I know I'm the only person in this room with a chance of it. And if you reach him, Hale said carefully, what do you offer him? She held the counselor's gaze. The truth. First. After that, she paused. That depends on what the king is prepared to give him. Every face at the table turned toward Vaelor. He met Seraphine's eyes across the room, and what passed between them in that moment wasn't a conversation. It was the specific recognition of two people who have separately arrived at the same hard understanding, that the path forward required a cost that neither of them had fully budgeted for. We'll discuss that, Vaelor said. The intelligence came that evening. The contact Vaelor had described as his most reliable source in the Eastern Territories arrived in person, which was unprecedented and therefore alarming, and debriefed Vaelor, Thorn, Seraphine, and 2 analysts in a secure room below the throne level. His name was Pharaoh, and he had the flat effect of a man who had spent so many years in proximity to terrible things that his emotional register had been recalibrated by necessity. Calum Vale had not been in imperial detention for 20 years. He had been in detention for 6 years. Released, escaped, the record was unclear, at age 15. In the 11 years since, he had built a network that Pharaoh described with the precise language of a man who had been measuring a thing growing in the dark and was still slightly surprised by how large it had gotten. We classify it as a movement rather than an army, Pharaoh said. At its core, roughly 2,000 individuals. Committed fighters, trained, organized into cells. But the outer network, he paused, 40 maybe 50,000 sympathizers across 6 territories. People who've been waiting for someone to give the surviving magical bloodlines and exiled communities an organized structure to attach to. He set a map on the table with marked concentrations. What makes him dangerous is not just the core fighters, it's the infrastructure, supply lines, safe houses, sympathizers in administrative positions in 3 major cities. He looked at Seraphine and then quickly away. He's been building this for a decade, with patience and intelligence. Seraphine was looking at the map. Her face was very still. Thorn said what was in the room. He's not trying to win a battle, he's trying to win a war. He's trying to win an argument, Vaelor said. Everyone looked at him. About whether this empire's foundations can hold. He's built the infrastructure to demonstrate that they can't. Not through military victory, but through the sustained cost of suppression. Every time the empire moves against him, the suppression proves his point. That's the trap. Elegant, Thorn said, his voice carrying the specific quality of a soldier respecting a tactical mind he would rather not be respecting. Pharaoh cleared his throat. There's more. He placed a second document on the table. A report from a former Loomborn healer who had joined Kalem's network 3 years ago and passed out 6 months back. The healer's assessment of what Kalem had become. Seraphine read it. She read it again. She set it down on the table, face down, and placed her palm flat against its back. Her jaw was set. Something was happening behind her eyes that she was not letting out. He's accessed the old powers, she said. The room absorbed this. The forbidden tier, she said. Flat. The ones the Lumaborn Council outlawed before the Purge because they drew on corruption rather than healing. The ones that can... She stopped. They're not healing powers. They're the inverse. They can unmake things. Tissue, structure, will. She looked at the map. He's been using them. On Imperial forces, Pharaoh said carefully. On anyone who gets in the way, she said. That's what the report says. She looked at Vaelor, and the look on her face was the specific one of a person who has received news that is both devastating and not entirely surprising. The kind where you understand you were afraid of exactly this, and now the fear has turned into a fact, and the fact is worse. He's in pain, she said. That's what this is. Everything he's doing is the architecture of someone who was in unbearable pain for a very long time and found the one thing that made the pain feel purposeful. He needs to be stopped, Thorn said. He needs to be heard, she said. He threatened to burn the capital. I know. Her voice went thin. I know what he threatened. I know what he's capable of. I know that if he uses what he's accessed at full scale... She pressed her palm harder against the document. I know. Don't lecture me about what he is. I know who he is. I also know what made him. Can you reach him? Vaelor said. She looked up. If I give you the conditions he'd listen to, Vaelor said, can you reach him? I don't know if there are conditions he'd listen to, she said. Then tell me what he'd need to believe. She was quiet for a long moment. Around her, the room waited. Thorn, arms crossed, jaw working. Pharaoh, still and attentive. The analysts not writing anything down, which meant they were very focused. He'd need to believe, she said slowly, that what's being offered isn't another version of what was done before. A transaction, a management solution. She looked at Vaelor. He'd need to believe that someone in power has genuinely reckoned with what happened. Not acknowledged, reckoned. She paused. I don't know if he believes that's possible anymore. I don't know if he believes power can reckon with anything. Then you'd need to show him it can, Vaelor said. That's very easy to say. I know, he said. She looked at him for a long time. The council, she said. Hale's question, what you're prepared to offer. You said we'd discuss it. Tell me what would matter. The archive, she said. Public. All of it. Not a select committee review. Public. The record of what happened, acknowledged officially, under your seal. She kept her gaze steady. The stolen territories. Legal processes to restore claims. Actual legal processes, not symbolic gestures. She paused. And the doctrine. The doctrine from the Purge era that classified magical bloodlines. Formally rescinded, not quietly discontinued. Formally. Her voice was level. Those are the things that would tell him something real happened, that aren't just words. The council will resist, he said. Yes, she said. And the question is what you're willing to do about that. Power does not fear resistance from enemies. Enemies are expected to resist. Their opposition is built into the calculation, accounted for, managed. What actually tests a leader's mettle is resistance from allies, from the people whose support is the structural architecture of their authority. When Vaelor Draven looked around this table at the faces of the people whose loyalty had helped him hold an empire together, and then looked at what that loyalty was about to cost him to keep, this was the kind of moment that revealed whether a king owned his throne or his throne owned him. He had told Seraphine once that most rulers learned that lesson too late. He had not told her he was still learning it himself. I know what I'm willing to do, he said. Then say it out loud, she said, so the room hears it. He looked at Thorn, at Pharaoh, at the two analysts who were very still. I'm going to request a full council emergency session tomorrow, he said. I'm going to present a formal proposal for public archive release, territorial restitution processes, and doctrinal rescission. He let the sentence land. And I'm going to do it with or without the council's unanimous agreement. Thorn's expression did something controlled and very complicated. You'll fracture the council, Pharaoh said, not as an objection, as information. Maybe, Vaelor said, or maybe the ones worth keeping will stay. He looked at Seraphine. Can you get a message to him? She was quiet for a moment. I know where he'd look, she said. There's a border settlement called Kael's Crossing. It's one of the original Loomborn way stations from before the Purge. It survived because nobody official knows what it was. He'd have contacts there. She paused. It's 4 days' ride. We have 3 days, Vaelor said. Then we need to leave tomorrow. The we hung in the air of the room with all the weight of a word used before its time. She heard it. He could see it in the slight shift of her expression, the recalibration, the decision to let it stand rather than correct it. Tomorrow, she said. He found her on the eastern balcony 2 hours past midnight, the city spread below them in the particular darkness of a place too large to ever go fully quiet. She was standing with her forearms on the stone rail, looking out, and she didn't turn when he came through the door. But she'd heard him. He knew because her shoulders dropped a half-inch, the specific kind of release that meant she'd been waiting. He stood beside her. Not close. Appropriate distance. For a while, neither of them said anything. The city breathed below them, 40,000 fires and 40,000 windows, and the mountain range at the horizon was a dark mass against stars. He named a sparrow ambassador, she said. It took him a moment to understand she was returning to what she'd said in the study, picking up a thread she'd dropped. What did he name the others? He said. The crow was called the Duke. The pigeons were all generals. He had a system. She paused. He used to draft formal correspondence to them, very serious letters about diplomatic relations. The ghost of something moved through her voice. He was funny. He was very, very funny. He might still be. She looked at the city. I don't know what's left of who he was, she said. That's what I'm most afraid of. Not what he can do, who he became because of what was done to him. Because if the person who sent that message is all that's left, she stopped. Then there's less to reach, she said. There's always something, he said. Even after everything, there's something. You believe that. I have to, he said. I govern on the assumption that people are reachable, that circumstances can change people, and that means circumstances can change them back. If I stop believing that, he paused, then I'm just administering. She turned her head and looked at him sidelong in the dark, and the expression on her face was one he hadn't seen from her yet. Something softer, not vulnerable exactly, more like someone who has decided to let a thing they've been carrying be visible for a moment. Just a moment. You're afraid too, she said. Yes, he said. Of what? He was quiet for a moment. That I'm going to lose the council, he said, and lose the structural stability that makes any of this possible, and be left standing in the ruins of an empire I broke trying to make right, and none of it will have been enough. He kept his eyes on the city. That the right thing done badly is still just damage with better intentions. She was quiet. Anisan, he said more carefully, that I've let you in close enough that when this goes wrong, and it might go wrong, the cost of it won't be abstract for me. The silence was different now. Different in quality, in temperature, in what it contained. She didn't answer him. She turned back to the city, and they stood there in the dark with the mountain range on the horizon, and the particular intimacy of two people who have said honest things to each other in the middle of the night and are deciding what to do with the aftermath. "We should sleep," she said finally. "Long ride tomorrow." "Yes," he said. She moved toward the door and paused with her hand on the frame. "Vaelor," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name. He looked at her. "Whatever's left of him," she said. "I have to choose him. You understand that?" "I understand," he said. "Even if—" "I understand," he said again, quiet and specific. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she went inside. He stood on the balcony for a long time after. Below him, the city slept. In the archive he'd opened to her, the documents she'd pulled lay in their new configuration, the shape of the buried truth beginning to emerge. In 3 days they would ride toward a border settlement and whatever waited there. He did not know what waited there. He did know, with the certainty of a man who had learned to read the mathematics of catastrophe, that the situation was about to exceed every plan he'd made for it. He did not know that the rider arriving at the palace gates at the 3rd hour of the morning was carrying a message not from Calum Vale, but from Lord Councillor Hale, sent to the 3 senior military commanders on the council without Vaelor's knowledge, without his authorization, without his understanding of what had already been set in motion. He did not know that Hale had made his own calculation. He did not know that the column of Imperial forces moving toward Kael's crossing in the dark was not acting on his orders. He did not know that by the time the sun rose, the 7 days of warning would no longer matter, because someone had already decided to end the question before it could be answered. The rider came through the eastern gate at the 3rd hour with mud on his horse and panic in his eyes, and the message he carried had already done its damage by the time anyone in the palace understood what it meant. Vaelor was still on the balcony when Idron found him. The guard's face carried the specific quality of controlled emergency, not fear, because Edron had trained fear out of himself years ago, but the tightened economy of a man who has just learned that the situation has changed category without asking permission. "My king," he held out the intercepted letter. "From the intelligence network. The courier was instructed to deliver directly to Commander Thace, bypassing your desk. He was intercepted at the gate checkpoint." Vaelor looked at the letter. He looked at the seal on it, which was not military command. It was Hale's personal mark. He broke it open and read it standing on the balcony with the city still dark below him. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment with the letter in his hand and the specific cold of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he was not watching closely enough because he was watching the problem in front of him instead of the problem behind him. "How long ago did the column move?" he said. "Estimated departure 4 hours ago," Edron said. 200 infantry, 40 cavalry. Imperial colors. Authorized under an emergency security provision that," he paused, "that was last used during the Purging Wars." Vaelor folded the letter. He had spent 11 years building a working relationship with Bren Van Hale on the understanding that Hale was a pragmatist who would oppose decisions he disagreed with through council channels, through process, through the grinding mechanisms of institutional friction. That was the negotiated reality of governing. You didn't need consensus. You needed the people who disagreed with you to keep their disagreement inside the architecture you'd both agreed to operate within. Hale had stepped outside the architecture. He had looked at the situation, performed his own arithmetic, and concluded that the answer Vaelor was moving toward was wrong enough to justify action taken without authorization. With military assets, directed at a settlement where 200 civilians were likely sleeping through the night with no knowledge of what was coming toward them. And at the end of that column's march was Kael's crossing, where Calum Vale's network had contacts, and where, if the column arrived before a message could be sent, an incident would occur that would end every possibility of what Vaelor had been trying to build. There is a particular education available only to those who hold authority over others. It comes not from the exercise of power, but from its betrayal. From the moment a leader discovers that the people operating within the structure of their authority have made a calculation about their own judgment being superior. That moment is not primarily about betrayal in the personal sense. It is about the structural question it forces. What does power mean if the people holding it in trust will hand it to their own conclusions the moment the cost of loyalty becomes inconvenient? Vaelor Draven had always understood, abstractly, that this was a vulnerability. He had not fully understood, until this moment, how cold it was when it arrived in practice. "Wake her," he said. But Seraphine was dressed in 3 minutes, which told him she hadn't been asleep. She came through the door with her satchel already over her shoulder and her jaw set and read the letter he handed her without visible reaction, the way a person reads something they were already half expecting. "Kael's crossing," she said. 4 hours ahead of us. Maybe less. If the column reaches it before we do, but there'll be an incident, he said. Imperial forces encountering suspected insurgent-affiliated individuals in a civilian settlement. The doctrine they're operating under authorizes... He stopped. She looked at him. "Lethal force against active resistance," he said. She looked down at the letter. She looked at it for a long time with an expression that was very contained, very deliberate, the way a person looks when they are deciding whether to let what they feel be useful or just let it be. "He'll know," she said. "If they hit that settlement without a message from me first, he'll know the negotiation was never real, that we came offering one hand and sent a fist with the other." She looked up. "And then everything he believes about what this empire is will have just been confirmed." "Then we ride now," Vaelor said. "With what authority?" she said. "You didn't authorize that column. You can't call it back through normal channels without the Council knowing I've lost operational command of my own military in the window of a single night," he said. "Yes." She held his gaze. "Can you stop them?" she said. "I can ride hard enough to reach them before they reach crossing," he said. "And I can countermand the order in person, which they cannot refuse without open mutiny." He paused. "But I'll be doing it in front of 200 soldiers, and word of this night will travel faster than either of us can manage." "You're going to have to reckon with Hale when you get back," she said. "Yes." "Publicly?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet he could see her calculating what this meant, what it was going to cost him, what it revealed about the structural reality underneath the conversation they'd been having about change and possibility, and what a king was prepared to give. "Then let's not waste time," she said. They rode with 6 guards, Idron at the front, horses pushed to the outer edge of sustainable pace on roads that were dark and wet from 2 days of rain. Vaelor rode with the letter in his coat and the cold clarity that comes from a problem that has resolved itself into a single necessary action, not comfortable, not certain of outcome, but clear in the way that crises can be when the choices have been reduced to one. Seraphine rode beside him. She did not speak much. She was looking at the road ahead with the expression of a person making internal calculations she wasn't sharing. 2 hours out, she said, "When we get there, if I see him, if there's a chance to reach him, I need you to give me room." "Define room," he said. "Don't come in behind me," she said. "Don't bring soldiers in close. If he sees military presence and me in the same frame, it reads wrong." She glanced at him. "He's going to be angry. He has a right to be angry. I need him to feel that I came for him, not that I brought the Empire to his door." "I'll keep a perimeter," he said. "Visible enough to be honest, but not close enough to read as threat." She looked at him sidelong. "You know how to do that. I've been negotiating from a position of force for 11 years, he said. "I know how far back force needs to stand." She turned back to the road. A pause. "When I was running with him," she said, "after our mother, I made every decision. I told him where to go, what to eat, when to sleep, which faces to trust. He was 6. He did what I said because I was all he had." She kept her eyes forward. "Then I lost him, and every decision I made after that for 20 years, I made with the understanding that I had failed the one responsibility that mattered." She paused. "I don't know who he became in the time I wasn't there. I don't know if he can hear me anymore. But I know that if there is anything left of the person who named a Sparrow ambassador, it's going to hear me and not the uniform beside me." Vaelor didn't answer that. He let it stand the way honest things should stand, without being improved upon. They caught the column before dawn, 3 miles from Kael's crossing, on a stretch of road where the mountain foothills crowded close and the trees were thick on either side. Vaelor rode up the column's flank at speed, and the soldiers gave way by instinct before they could think about it. When a king rides at you in the dark at that pace, the body moves before the mind has finished its debate. Commander Theus was at the rear, and his face when he saw Vaelor was the specific combination of surprise and the controlled recalibration of a man who had known he was gambling and had just seen the odds shift. He pulled his horse up. His jaw was tight. "My king," he said. The courtesy was formal and hollow. "Stop the column," Vaelor said. Theus didn't move immediately, which was itself information. "Commander?" Vaelor's voice dropped to the register he reserved for moments when he needed the word to carry weight without needing to be repeated. "I will say this once. Stop the column." The order went forward. The column halted, the sound of it moving through the ranks in segments, hooves slowing, equipment settling, the creak of gear going still. 200 people stopped on a dark road because of a single voice, and that was power in its most naked form, the kind that didn't require explanation, only presence. Theus sat on his horse and looked at the king he'd been circumventing 4 hours ago. "You were given an authorization," he started. "By hail," Vaelor said, "under an emergency provision that requires my countersignature, which you don't have." He looked at the commander with the flatness of a man who is very angry and has chosen to be very still about it, because stillness in a king is more frightening than volume. "You know you don't have it. You proceeded anyway." The situation required, Vaelor said, that you wait for orders from the person you took an oath to serve. Instead, you took orders from a counselor who has no military authority and acted on a provision that hasn't been invoked in 20 years without my authorization. He paused. "Which of those facts are you planning to contest?" Theus' jaw worked. He was young and capable and believed. Vaelor could see it clearly now. The specific clarity that came from watching a man's mask slip, believed that he was right. That was the thing about institutional insubordination. It was almost never cynical. It was almost always conviction. The person who bypassed authority almost always believed they were serving something larger than the authority they were bypassing, and that belief made it impossible to simply be wrong. It had to be righteousness. Righteousness was the hardest thing to argue with. "The woman is a liability," Theus said. "Her brother is a direct threat to the capital. The connection between them," Vaelor said, "is the only negotiating channel we have, which you would know if you'd been in the debrief." He let a pause land. "Were you in the debrief, Commander?" Theus had been in the debrief. "You heard the analysis," Vaelor said. "You understood the network size, the infrastructure, the position we're in, and you went to hail anyway." He looked at the stopped column, the 200 faces who were not making eye contact with anything specific. "Turn them around." "My king!" "Turn them around, Commander. Return to the capital. Report to the barracks. I'll deal with the authorization question when I return." He looked at Theus with the patient finality of a man who is done negotiating the thing that isn't negotiable. "If you'd like to make the alternative argument, you can do that in front of the full council when I call the session to address Hale's decision. But you will do it there, through the correct channel, and not here on a dark road 2 miles from a civilian settlement." Theus looked at him for a long moment. In that moment, Vaelor watched the man calculate the weight of what he was facing. The king in person, the legal authority, the optics of mutiny made explicit, against the weight of his conviction, and watched conviction bend. Not break, bend. "Yes, my king," Theus said. The words tasted bad in his mouth. He turned his horse and the column began its reversal. The long, grinding machinery of 200 soldiers pointed back the way they'd come. Vaelor sat on his horse and watched it go, and felt the specific tiredness that came not from exertion, but from the sustained management of people who were continuously deciding whether the authority above them was worth following. It was the deep exhaustion of governance, not the decisions themselves, but the ongoing cost of holding the structure together while making them. Some kings solved this by becoming smaller, by making only decisions their inner circle would accept. Some solved it by becoming cruel, by making the cost of dissent too high for calculation. Vaelor had spent 11 years trying to solve it by being worth following, which was the most expensive option and the only one he could respect himself for. Tonight had cost him something he couldn't fully quantify yet. He turned his horse toward Kael's crossing. The settlement was a dozen buildings arranged around a well on the edge of what had been, 300 years ago, a significant crossroads. Now it was a place people passed through on the way to other places, unremarkable enough to survive by virtue of not being worth anyone's attention. Seraphine rode in first, as agreed. Vaelor held the perimeter with Edron and the 4 remaining guards, horses still, the tree line at their backs, far enough to read as not threat, close enough to be honest. He watched her ride into the square. He watched the settlement not react in the way a settlement reacts to something expected. There were lights in windows. Someone was moving near the well. A man came out of the closest building's door and stopped when he saw her, and the conversation that followed was too far for Vaelor to hear. He watched the man go back inside. He watched a different door open, across the square. He watched the person who came through it, and even at distance, even with the uncertain light of pre-dawn and the space between them, he could see what Seraphine saw, because her body changed. Her shoulders went up slightly and then dropped hard, both things happening in the space of a second, the brace and then the release. And she dismounted, and the horse wandered slightly to the left, and she didn't correct it. She was walking toward her brother. Vaelor kept his position and watched, and did not hear what passed between them. What passed between them was this. Calum Vale was taller than she expected. That was the first thing she registered, which was absurd. He was 27. Of course he was tall. Of course the 6-year-old she'd been running with had grown into a man she wouldn't have recognized in a crowd. But the body knowledge of him was still set at 6 years old in some part of her, and the distance between that and the person standing across the square was a physical sensation, like touching something that's the wrong temperature. He looked like their mother. That was the second thing. The structure of his face, the line of his jaw. Their mother had been beautiful in the way of people who don't try at it, and Calum had inherited the bones without the ease. His face was the same foundation built into something harder, more deliberate, the beauty present but rearranged by what had happened to it. He looked at her without speaking for a long time. She was aware of the light in her hand starting up and pressed it down by reflex, the way you press a reflex down when you've spent 20 years making it quiet, and she saw him notice, and something moved in his expression. "You're alive," he said. His voice was wrong, not in a damaged way. It was a good voice, controlled, deep enough to carry. Wrong because she had been listening to it in her memory for 2 decades, and the memory was a child's voice, and this was not a child. "So are you," she said. He looked at her for another moment. "Did you bring him?" he said. She didn't ask who he meant. "Yes." "How close?" "Far enough to be honest," she said. "He's not here for you. He's here because someone else tried to move on the settlement without his knowledge, and he stopped them." Calum's expression did something quick and contained. "How convenient." "It's not convenient," she said. "It's complicated. Everything about this situation is complicated, and you know that, because you're not a person who makes plans this sophisticated without understanding the complications." She looked at him. "Calum." He looked back. "I looked for you," she said, "for 8 years. Every contact I could build, every rumor." "I know," he said. "You know." "I found the records," he said, 3 years ago. "I know you looked. I know what you found and what you didn't find." He paused. "I know you stopped." She felt that land. "I stopped because the trail ended with a death record, and I had—" She stopped. "I had to keep surviving. That was the only thing I could do." "I know that too," he said, and his voice was not accusatory, which was almost worse because absence of accusation from someone who had a right to it implied something more unreachable. He wasn't angry at her. He was beyond angry at her. He had sorted her into the category of things he had processed and filed and moved past. "Don't do that," she said. "Do what?" "Put me in the column with everything you've already decided about," she said. "I'm not the Empire. I'm not the Council. I'm not the people who held you for 6 years and documented your death for convenience. I'm the person who spent 8 years trying to find you, and then spent 12 more years trying to build the evidence that would make what happened to us real, official, provable." Her voice was steady. She needed it to be steady. "I'm the person who is the only reason there's a king out there who's willing to formally reckon with what his empire did, instead of manage it quietly into a compromise that protects the people who made the decisions." Calum was quiet. "And I'm your sister," she said. which should still mean something. He looked at her for a long time, and in that look she saw the arithmetic she'd watched Vaelor do, the same rapid internal process. But the variables were different. The variables were grief and damage, and the specifically complex mathematics of a person deciding whether to let themselves feel something they've been protecting themselves from. "What is he offering?" he said finally. "Full public archive disclosure," she said. "Territorial restitution processes. Formal doctrinal rescission." She paused. "His word. In front of the council. Under his seal." "His word," Calum said. "His word and the political cost of the position he's about to take," she said. "He's going to fracture his council over this. He may lose institutional support he needs. He's doing it anyway." She met her brother's eyes. "That's not nothing, Calum. It's not enough," he said. "Not hostile, just true." "I know," she said. 20 years of people," he said. 20 years of everyone who survived what we survived. Everyone who's been hiding. Everyone who's been living under documentation that says they're extinct or dangerous or manageable. His word and a process doesn't give them back. "I know," she said again. "Then what are we talking about?" he said. "If you know it's not enough." "We're talking about the difference between something and nothing," she said. "We're talking about the difference between a direction and no direction. We're talking about—" She stopped and then, "Calum, what you've accessed, the powers." His expression shut down slightly. "I read the healer's assessment," she said. "I know what tier you've been using. I know what it costs. I know what it does to the person using it, beyond the immediate effect." She looked at him with the clinical precision of someone who grew up understanding the Loomborn systems at their source. "You know it too." "It works," he said. "It works and it eats," she said. "You know that. You've known it since you first touched it. The corruption doesn't stop at the target. It internalizes. It rewrites." She kept her voice level. "How long before you can't distinguish between the anger that's yours and the anger that's the power looking for an outlet?" His jaw was hard. "I'm asking because I need to know if I'm talking to my brother," she said, "or to someone the corruption has already started to replace." The pre-dawn silence of the settlement held around them. Somewhere a horse shifted weight. Wind moved through the tree line. "I'm still here," he said. "Then hear me," she said. "What you've built, the network, the infrastructure, the people who've attached their survival to what you represent, they deserve a future. Not a war that ends with the Empire's resources ground against your capabilities until one side runs out. Not another cycle." She took a breath. "He's offering an actual exit. It's not justice. It's not enough. But it's a direction that doesn't end with you burning yourself out on powers that will eventually take you entirely. And it doesn't end with the capital and 400,000 people who didn't make the decisions that hurt you." Babasai, Calum looked at her for a long time. "I want to meet him," he said. She exhaled. "I know. Not as a king," he said. "Not with the guards visible. I want to look at him and decide for myself whether there's anything real behind what you're saying." "He'll agree to that," she said. "You're certain?" She thought of the balcony, the candles, the maps. A man reading old records because his grandmother left him an unfinished obligation he couldn't let go. "Yes," she said. What happened next happened in the space of 20 minutes. And Vaelor would think about those 20 minutes for the rest of his life with the specific quality of attention reserved for the moments that redraw the map. He met Calum Vale in the clearing at the settlement's northern edge, with his own guards visible at distance, and Calum's two flanking contacts standing 30 feet back, and everyone aware that the perimeter was porous enough to matter. Calum Vale looked at him. The way men look at things they have organized their entire interior life around hating when those things turn out to be more complex than the organizational principle allows for. Vaelor had seen it before, in enemies who had expected a monster and found a person, in people who'd built their anger on a clean certainty and discovered that certainty had edges. It didn't dissolve the anger, it just confused the targeting. "She told me what you're offering," Calum said. "Then you know it," Vaelor said. "I know what you told her," Calum said. "That's different." "Yes," Vaelor said. "It is." Calum looked at him steadily. There was something in the look that Vaelor recognized from the mirror. The specific quality of a person who has been alone with a decision for a very long time and is now performing real-time assessment of whether everything they decided still holds. You can't give back the dead, Calum said. No, Vaelor said. You can't give back the years. No. The people who made the decisions, the ones who actually held authority, who signed the orders, who organized the purge, they're dead. You can prosecute their legacy, but you can't prosecute them. That's correct, Vaelor said. Calum's jaw tightened. Then explain to me why I should let an empire that murdered my people off the hook with a public apology and a process. Vaelor was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking you to let anyone off the hook, he said. I'm asking you to consider what the hook is for. Punishment of people who are already dead is a narrative. What I'm offering is structural. The systems that made those decisions possible, the doctrine, the institutional frameworks, the power structures that enabled it, those can be dismantled, not symbolically, actually. He met Calum's eyes. That's not forgiveness, that's architecture. And it matters more, long-term, than any war you could fight. Calum looked at him. You've been reading, he said, and it wasn't a compliment exactly, but it was an acknowledgement. I've been trying to understand what I inherited, Vaelor said, for a long time. And did you? I understood enough to know the inheritance is wrong, Vaelor said. That's not the same as knowing how to fix it, but it's the necessary precondition. He paused. I need you to not burn my city. I need you to give me the chance to build what I'm proposing. If I fail, if I take the position in front of my council and it destroys my capacity to govern and nothing changes, then your argument that the empire is unreformable will have evidence behind it. He looked at the man across from him. Give me the chance to prove you wrong. Calum was quiet. Into the quiet came the sound from the road. The sound was wrong. It arrived wrong, yet horses, but too many, and moving fast, and from the direction of the capital, not the direction of the retreating column. Edrin was already moving. My king! The first arrow came from the tree line. It missed. By inches. Vaelor moved by instinct, body turning before the mind had processed the sound, and the arrow went past his shoulder and hit the settlement wall behind him. And everyone who had been performing the careful choreography of a negotiation became, in the space of a second, something else entirely. Calum's hands went up, and they were lit, not like Seraphine's light. Seraphine's light was warm, gold-threaded, the light of something that healed. This was colder, with a blue-white edge that didn't comfort, and it went out from his palms in a visible wave that hit the tree line, and the sound from the tree line changed character immediately. Hold, Vaelor said, loud enough to carry to his guards. Hold. More horses. The second contingent came through the settlement's southern access. Not imperial colors, not military formation. A dozen riders in civilian clothes with crossbows and the specific coordination of people who had rehearsed this. Not soldiers. Something else. Private force. Hale's force. Not the column. That had turned back. This was the backup. The contingency Hale had prepared for the possibility that the column would be stopped. The option that said, if the king countermands the military action, use private assets, because private assets don't require authorization, and they don't answer to a throne they've decided is moving in the wrong direction. Vaelor understood it all in the space of 3 seconds, and felt the cold specific arrival of the kind of anger that doesn't heat up. It went down. The riders hit the square and the negotiation became a battlefield. Seraphine was between her brother and the closest rider before Vaelor could track her movement, and the light from her hands was different from Calum's but no less real, and she threw it like something physical. A force that wasn't healing and wasn't destruction, but was the specific energy of a thing placed between an attacker and a target. The rider's horse shied and threw him. Vaelor's guards moved. Calum Vael stood in the middle of the settlement square with his arms spread and the cold light building around him, and every person who had read the intelligence reports on what he was capable of understood what was about to happen if it wasn't stopped. And Seraphine turned to her brother and said something fast and low and urgent that Vaelor couldn't hear. Calum looked at her. The light held. Calum, she said, And this time Vaelor heard it. Just his name. Just her voice. Just the specific frequency of a person who has one thing left to offer and is offering it. The light went down. The riders were being contained by Vaelor's guard, and Caelim's flanking contacts working in grim coordination, the strange, improvised alliance of people who had just been negotiating against each other and were now managing a shared emergency. The square was full of noise and controlled violence, and the specific chaos of a situation that had almost become something irreversible and had been held, barely, at the edge. Vaelor stood in the middle of it and looked at Hale's private riders, bound and sat against the settlement wall, and then at his own guard, and then at Caelim Vael, who was looking back at him with an expression that had been reconfigured by the last 3 minutes into something new. Not trust, not resolution, but something. The absence of a certainty that had just failed its final test. Hale had tried to prevent the negotiation, had committed private force against a king's decision, and in doing so had handed Caelim Vael the most compelling possible argument for the opposite conclusion, that the Empire was not monolithic, that inside the Empire was a war, and the outcome of that war was not decided. Seraphine was standing beside her brother, not close enough to touch him, close enough to be present. "He tried to stop this," Caelim said to Vaelor. Not a question. "Yes," Vaelor said. "One of your own." "Yes." "And you came anyway?" "Yes," Vaelor said. "I came anyway." The pre-dawn light was shifting. The mountains at the horizon were beginning to separate from the sky. Around them, the settlement was waking up fully now, faces at windows, the reality of what had just happened settling into the ordinary air of an ordinary road in an ordinary place that history had briefly decided to use. Caelim looked at his sister. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that was not language. He looked back at Vaelor. "When you go back," he said, "and you face your council, the one who did this." He gestured at the bound riders. "What happens to him?" Vaelor looked at the riders, at the arrow still embedded in the settlement wall behind where he'd been standing. He thought about Bren von Hale, who had served 2 kings and understood the Empire's machinery better than almost anyone living, who had spent 40 years building the kind of institutional authority that made men like Theus possible, who had looked at the situation and decided that his judgment was worth more than the authority of the crown above him. He thought about what it meant to call that what it was. In any calculation of power, there is a threshold. Before the threshold, a leader can absorb opposition, negotiate around it, find the path that preserves the structure while redirecting the energy. After the threshold, the structure itself is the question, whether the authority that the leader represents is real, or whether it is a performance that will continue only as long as it is convenient for those performing it. Vaelor Draven had crossed that threshold somewhere in the last 24 hours, and he had not been given the option of stepping back across it. The only choice left was what he was going to do with the side he was now on. There was a version of this where he returned to the capital and managed it, where Hale was quietly retired with honors, and the private force was dissolved without official acknowledgement, and the episode was absorbed into the institutional memory as a disagreement that was handled internally. That version preserved the surface. That version let the council continue to function and let the relationships Vaelor needed intact, and let him proceed with the reform proposals from a position of structural stability. That version was also the version that told everyone watching, Caelim, his network, the surviving communities, the people who'd been waiting for proof of what the Empire actually was, that what had just happened on this road was manageable, that the Empire handled its internal betrayals the way it had always handled them. Quietly, internally, with the violence smoothed over and the record reflecting whatever was most convenient. He looked at Caelim Vael. "He's going to answer for it," Vaelor said, "publicly, on record, under my authority and under the council's formal process." He paused. "Whatever it costs me to make that happen. I'm going to make it happen." Caelim held his gaze for a long moment. "Then I'll wait," he said. 30 days. I'll hold what I've built, and I'll wait 30 days. He looked at Seraphine. "She comes to me with the record of what you do, not a summary, the actual record." "Agreed," Vaelor said. "If in 30 days there's nothing real behind what you've said," Caelim said, "then we're done negotiating." "Understood," Vaelor said. Caelim looked at him one more time. The look of a man filing an impression, deciding what category it belongs in, reserving the final classification for later. Then he turned and walked back into the settlement, and his two contacts fell in behind him, and they were gone. Vaelor stood in the square with the dawn coming, and the bound riders against the wall and the arrow in the wood behind him, and felt the specific gravity of the position he had just locked himself into. He turned to Seraphine. She was looking at the door through which Calum had disappeared, and her expression was doing several things simultaneously. The relief and the grief and the unsettled business of a reunion that had been nothing like what the 8-year-old running with him had ever imagined, and underneath all of it, steady and unignorable, the look of a woman who is deciding whether to let herself believe something. 30 days, she said. 30 days, he said. She looked at him. You understand what you just committed to? Yes, he said. Hale has support on the council, real support, the kind built over decades. When you move against him, I know what I'll lose, he said. She held his gaze. Then you understand, she said, that there's no version of the next 30 days where you don't become someone different from who you were before tonight. He looked at the arrow in the wall, at the riders, at the dawn beginning to come over the mountains. I know, he said. The word sat between them with the weight of a door closing behind a person who has just walked through it and understood fully that it only opens one direction. He turned his horse toward the capital and the reckoning waiting there, and the person riding back was not exactly the person who had ridden out. The crown had asked for everything. He had just agreed to give it. The ride back to the capital took 4 hours, and Vaelor spent most of it deciding the order of things, not weather. The weather had been decided on the road at Kael's crossing when he'd looked at Hale's private riders sitting bound against a settlement wall and understood that the negotiated reality of his reign had just ended. You don't survive a betrayal by pretending it was a disagreement. You don't hold authority by absorbing the actions of people who've decided your authority is conditional on their approval. The moment you accept that framing, the moment you manage it quietly and move on, you've told everyone watching where the actual ceiling of your power sits. So not weather, only order, only sequence, only the question of how to dismantle 11 years of Brenvan Hale's institutional architecture in 30 days without destroying the structural stability that made the reform proposals viable in the first place. Seraphine rode beside him for the first 2 hours without speaking, which he'd come to understand was her version of thinking out loud, the silence that had content in it that was doing work. At the 3rd hour, she said, "You need to move on Hale before he moves on you." "I know," he said. "He'll be working this council contacts the moment word comes back that the column turned around," she said, framing the narrative, making the case that you chose a Luma-born woman over the Empire's security. He'll use the language of protection. He'll make it sound like concern. "He'll be convincing," Vaelor said. "He's been convincing for 40 years, she said. "That's the problem." "The private force changes the math," Vaelor said. "He can frame the column as a security response. He can't frame using private armed assets against a sitting king as anything but what it is." She was quiet for a moment. "Unless he argues it was directed at me, not you." Vaelor looked at the road ahead. "Then we make sure the first conversation he has is with me," he said, "and not with the people he's been building toward." She nodded once, which was her version of agreement without enthusiasm. He convened the council within 2 hours of returning to the capital, which gave Hale no time to organize and no time to perform the careful pre-meeting work of lining up votes, and this was entirely intentional. The emergency session notification arrived at every council member's door simultaneously, carried by different runners, so no one member could receive it first and begin the work of response. Hale walked into the chamber looking composed, which was its own form of information. Composed meant he'd been prepared for this. Composed meant he had a position ready. Vaelor waited until every member was seated. Then he stood and he put the letter on the table. Hale's original communication to Theus, the one authorizing the column under emergency provision without royal countersignature. He put it beside the report from Idron documenting the private riders, their equipment, their coordination, and the arrow that had come from the tree line while a king was standing in the open. He didn't say anything. He let the documents exist in the room. Hali looked at them. His expression didn't change in any way that would be visible to most observers. To Vaelor, who had been reading this man across tables for 11 years, the micro-adjustments in his jaw and the recalibration behind his eyes were as clear as a spoken sentence. He hadn't expected the private riders to be documented this quickly. "Lord Counselor," Vaelor said. "My king." Hale's voice was steady. "You authorized a military column under emergency security provision without my countersignature," Vaelor said. "When that column was turned back, you deployed private armed assets against a negotiation I was conducting in person." He paused. "I'd like your explanation." "My king," Hale said, and his voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades making difficult positions sound reasonable. "The situation required—" "I heard that phrase last night from Commander Theus," Vaelor said. "I'd like something more specific." Hale looked at him for a moment. Then, with the calculated decision of a man who has assessed the room and decided that the oblique approach is no longer viable, he shifted. "The Luma-born woman in this palace represents a direct threat to the stability of 40 years of institutional order," he said, dropping the warmth, using the flat authority of someone who believes they are speaking a larger truth than the person across from them. "Her brother has organized a force capable of threatening the capital. Her presence here provides him intelligence, access, and the implicit endorsement of the crown." He looked around the table. "I acted on an emergency provision that exists precisely for situations where speed matters more than process. I acted because I still believe, that the direction this king has chosen in the last 72 hours leads somewhere the Empire cannot survive." The chamber absorbed this. Several faces around the table were not entirely opposed to what Hale had said. Vaelor could see it, the careful neutrality of people who were waiting to see how the weight came down before committing. "You believe," Vaelor said. "Yes," Hale said. "You believe so completely that you deployed force against your king without authorization," Vaelor said. "Not because I was wrong, because you believed I was wrong." "There is a difference," Hale said, "between a king's authority and a king's decision." "Explain that difference to me." "A king's authority is the structural fact of the throne," Hale said. "A king's decision is a choice made by a man who can be wrong. When a decision threatens the structural stability that the authority is supposed to protect, then the person who disagrees with that decision commits private armed force without authorization," Vaelor said. "That's the argument you're making." "I'm making the argument that there are situations—" "You are making the argument," Vaelor said, and his voice came down in register in a way that stopped the sentence across from him dead, "that your judgment is the correct ceiling above which my decisions can be overridden. You are making the argument that 40 years of service gives you the authority to decide when the king is wrong enough that the proper channels no longer apply." He let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. "I want the council to hear that argument clearly, because it has implications that go past this room and past this situation." The chamber was very still. Maelis, at the far end, had her hands flat on the table and was looking at Hale with an expression that had shifted from cautious neutrality to something more specific. Vaelor had always thought Maelis was a hard read. Right now she was reading clearly. She was a woman whose entire expertise was institutional security, and Hale had just made the argument that private armed force against a sitting king was an appropriate security measure, and that argument had a name that she was applying to it in real time. "Lord Counselor Hale," Vaelor said, "you are removed from this council, effective immediately. Under the authority of the Crown and the emergency provisions you yourself invoked, your removal is immediate and requires no vote." He kept his voice even. "You will be formally charged with unauthorized deployment of military assets and the use of private armed force against the Crown. The process will be public and on the record." He looked at Hale. "That is the difference between your authority and mine. You have the right to believe I'm wrong. You don't have the right to act on it with weapons." Hale sat very still for a moment. Then he stood, smoothed his jacket, looked at Vaelor with the expression of a man closing a very long chapter and deciding whether to be angry about it. "You're going to burn this empire trying to fix it," Hale said. "Maybe," Vaelor said, "but it'll be my fire." Hale walked out of the chamber and the door closed behind him, and the council sat in the specific silence of a room where an era has just ended and no one is certain what comes next. Tashi. The 30 days were the most difficult of Vaelor's reign, not because of what Hale did from outside. He did less than expected, the charges having effectively collapsed his network of influence faster than even Vaelor had calculated. Because the people who had aligned with Hale had done so on the basis of his access and his safety, and a man facing formal charges had neither. Institutions are loyal to survival before they are loyal to persons. Vaelor had understood this abstractly. He understood it now with the specific concrete knowledge of watching Hale's network dissolve like salt in moving water. What made the 30 days difficult was the cost of the reform proposals themselves. The public archive release happened in the second week. Vaelor signed the authorization in front of the full council, the remaining members, and a delegation of 6 journalists from the capital's major publications. The record went public in 3 days: the original documents, the land grants, the correspondence, the operational records from the Purge-era facilities, the historical accounting of what had been done. The response was not uniform. That was the thing the stories about redemption never adequately captured: the messy, exhausting, unglamorous reality of a population confronting a history it had been handed in edited form. Some people were horrified. Some were angry, directed at the crown, directed at the institutions, directed at the abstract past that had produced the specific present. Some people were resistant, finding reasons why the documents were incomplete, or the framing was biased, or the timing was political. Some were indifferent in the way of people who have too much in their own lives to absorb the weight of historical accounting. None of it was clean. None of it resolved into the clear moral landscape that people in the grip of a genuine wrong tend to imagine the acknowledgement of that wrong will produce. It was complicated and loud, and it generated more conflict in some ways than silence had, because silence at least had a stable surface. Seraphine worked through it. She was present for the archive release, not displayed. She'd been explicit about that. She was not a symbol. She was a person, and she did not want her image attached to the release in a way that let anyone argue the disclosure was personal rather than institutional. She worked from the archive itself, in the weeks that followed, building the complete record she'd described. She had meetings with surviving community representatives that Vaelor facilitated but did not attend. She was doing the work on the ground that the structural decisions from above could enable but not replace. He watched her from the appropriate distance that the situation required and felt, at that distance, something he had been careful about naming. Not because he didn't know what it was, because naming it carried implications for 30 days that were already operating at maximum complexity. On the 22nd day, the message came from Kylam, not the accommodation they'd agreed on, Seraphine carrying the record to her brother directly. This was a different kind of message, short, in the coded dialect she'd described, and she read it at the breakfast table in the small room off the archive where she'd taken to working through meals, and her face went through 2 distinct things before settling into the expression she used for decisions she'd already made that she hadn't announced yet. "He wants to meet," she said. "Not in the settlement. In Alaris." Vaelor set down his cup. "The old Lumi-born capital. What's left of it," she said. "Under the Veldris Mountains." She looked at him. "He wants to bring the leadership of his network, the core representatives. He wants them to hear it directly from you, not through me, not through a document, from the king." "In the ruins of the city his people came from," Vaelor said. "Yes," she said, "which he knows is also where this could go very wrong very fast." "He knows," she said. "He's also the one who proposed it, which means something." Vaelor looked at the map on the table beside her breakfast. Alaris. 3 days' ride into the mountains, through terrain that would be impossible to navigate with a significant military force, which meant whatever he brought, he'd be bringing light, and it would be visible and there would be no cavalry over the ridgeline as a contingency. Going meant trusting, not fully, not blindly, but enough. 8 days left in the 30, she said. "I know," he said. "If you don't go—" "I know," he said again. She looked at him steadily. "I need to know if you're going to do this." "I'm going to do this," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and began writing the response. Din. Alaris was not what Vaelor had expected, which was ruins in the conventional sense, collapsed walls, overgrown foundations, the archaeological debris of a civilization. What the Veldris Mountains held instead was something more specific and more terrible. The city had been burned, yes, but before the burning it had been emptied, and the emptying was visible in the structure. Buildings with their contents removed before the fires. Storage chambers cleared. The systematic efficiency of a destruction that knew what it was taking and what it was leaving behind. Whoever had planned the purge had not been interested in property. They'd been interested in people and knowledge and the specific things that people and knowledge produce. What remained was the bones of a place that had been deliberately orphaned from its own continuation. He stood in what had been the main sanctuary courtyard and felt the weight of it the way you feel the weight of large things that happened before you were born, but that your existence is entangled with regardless. Calum Vael was already there. With him were 9 people. The core leadership Seraphine had described, representatives of the surviving communities that had attached themselves to his network. They ranged in age from a woman who might have been 70 to a young man who couldn't have been 20. They all had the specific quality of people who had been careful for a very long time and had not entirely decided to stop. Seraphine stood beside her brother. She had not stood beside Vaelor for this arrival, which he understood and respected. Her position in this room was specific, and he was not going to confuse it. He came with Idrin and 3 guards, who stopped at the courtyard entrance. He walked in alone. The ground under his boots was old stone and old ash, and the specific silence of a place that had last held the full weight of human occupation 20 years ago. The mountain walls around them filtered the afternoon light into something cooler and older than what existed outside. He stopped 10 feet from Calum, close enough for conversation, far enough to not be claiming anything. "You came," Calum said. "You asked," Vaelor said. Calum looked at him, and the look was different from Kael's crossing. At the settlement there had been active assessment, the rapid arithmetic of a man deciding whether to trust. This was something further along than assessment. This was the look of a person who had already made a provisional decision and was checking it against the reality of the moment. 22 days, Calum said. Hale is facing formal charges. The archive is public. The territorial restitution processes have been initiated in 2 regions. He paused. You did what you said. I did what I said, Vaelor confirmed. 8 days left, Calum said. What happens in the last 8? The doctrinal rescission goes to formal vote, Vaelor said. I have the votes. It passes. He met Calum's eyes. And I'd like to make a public address, with you present, not performing unity. I'm not asking you to stand beside me and pretend 20 years didn't happen. I'm asking you to be visibly present while I say, on the official record, what this empire did and what it's going to do differently. He paused. Your presence makes it real in a way my words alone don't. The courtyard was quiet around them. The woman who might have been 70 said something in the old dialect to Calum, low and direct. He answered briefly. She was quiet. What does that cost you? One of the other representatives said to Vaelor. A man in his 40s with the bearing of someone who had spent time in military structures, though not imperial ones. Politically, significantly, Vaelor said. I've already lost 1 major council architect. The address will be read as capitulation by the institutional right. There will be formal opposition. There may be attempts to challenge the doctrinal vote. He looked at the man directly. It costs me political capital. I'll spend the next several years rebuilding. And you're doing it anyway, the man said. Yes, Vaelor said. Why? There is a question that sounds simple and isn't. Why? When the cost is clear, and the outcome is uncertain, and the structural pressure is entirely in the direction of the easier path, does a person choose the harder one? The cynical answer is that there's always a self-interest buried in apparent sacrifice, and the cynical answer is not always wrong. But there is another answer, available to people who have sat long enough with the actual weight of inherited wrong to understand that the wrong doesn't stay buried, that it surfaces through every generation in the form of the thing they're currently managing, that the cost of honest reckoning now is always less than the cost of the delayed reckoning that comes anyway, compounded by years of suppression and denial. Because the people who built this empire made choices, Vaelor said. I've spent 11 years benefiting from those choices and calling it inheritance. At some point, the word stops being accurate. He looked around the courtyard, at the burned sanctuary walls, at the cleared storage chambers, at the bones of a place that had been deliberately orphaned. This is what those choices look like from the inside. I've been living in the outside. He looked at Caleb. I can't give you back what was taken. I can't give you back the years or the people or this city, but I can make sure the choices that produce this don't produce it again. That's what I'm trying to do. He paused. That's the only answer I have. Caleb was very still. The light in the courtyard shifted, moving with the clouds over the mountain ridge. Around them, Alaris held its particular silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a place that had held a lot of sound once and remembered it. Caleb looked at his sister. Seraphine held his gaze with the expression of a person who has been waiting for a specific moment and is watching it either arrive or not arrive. All right, Caleb said. The words were quiet, and they were not triumphant because this was not a triumphant moment. It was an agreement made in ruins by people who had come here from opposite sides of an enormous wrong and were trying to find the ground between them. And the ground was real, but it was not solid yet, and everyone present knew it. All right, Vaelor said. The return from Alaris took 3 days. On the second night, camped in the mountain pass with the city behind them, and the capital still a day ahead, Seraphine sat beside the fire, and Vaelor sat across it, and Idron had taken the far watch with characteristic discretion, and the night was cold, the way mountain nights are cold even in late summer. He was different in there, she said, in the courtyard. From the settlement? From the last 20 years of what I imagined he'd become, she said. She was looking at the fire. I built a version of him in my head while I was looking for him, and then another version after I stopped. And both versions were the grief versions, the imaginary. Seeing him real is different. She paused. He's damaged. I won't pretend he isn't. What was done to him is in him. It's going to be in him for the rest of his life. She said this plainly, without softening, but he's still there, underneath it. The person who named the sparrow, Vaelor said. She looked up at him briefly. Yes. She looked back at the fire. That's what I needed to know. That's all I needed. The fire moved. Somewhere on the ridge, a night bird called once and went quiet. What happens after the address? She said. Politically? 6 months of managed opposition, probably. The institutions that Hale's departure destabilized will need new leadership. The doctrinal rescission will generate legal challenges from several jurisdictions. The territorial restitution processes will take years. He looked at the fire. It won't be clean. It's never clean, she said. No. What happens to you, she said. Slight correction of emphasis. Not the political question, the other one. He looked at her across the fire and felt the specific weight of the moment, the 30 days behind them, the work ahead, the two of them in the specific geography of a conversation that had been approaching its real topic for a long time. That depends on answers to questions I haven't asked yet, he said. She held his gaze. Ask them. When the sanctuary of balance is built, he started. If, she said. When, he said. You'll build it. You've been building it since you were 8 years old, piece by piece. It just didn't have a name yet. He looked at her directly. When it's built, and when the work is past its most critical phase, and when you've had the time and space to decide what you want that isn't defined by what you've been surviving, is there room in what you want for something that isn't the work? She was quiet for a moment. That's a careful question, she said. I'm a careful person, he said. She looked at the fire again, and the expression on her face was the one he'd cataloged carefully over 30 days. The one that appeared when she was weighing something real against the reflex to protect herself from it. Ask me again, she said. In 6 months. When I know what the work looks like, and I know what you look like inside it. She met his eyes. But yes, there's room. The fire moved between them with the particular warmth of something that didn't need to be named, yet to be real. The 29th day arrived like all consequential days do, unremarkably, preceded by an ordinary morning, carrying in its hours the weight that only became apparent when you looked back at it from the other side. The address was scheduled for the late afternoon from the main steps of the council hall, in the public square where the ceremonial proceedings of Astrolith's governance had been conducted for 300 years. Vaelor had chosen the location deliberately, not the throne room, Not the enclosed authority of institutional space, but the open square where ordinary people could stand and hear. He was in the preparation room adjacent to the council chamber when Adron came through the door with the expression that meant something had happened. "Calum Vael," Edron said. He came. Early. Vaelor stilled. "Where is he?" "At the southern gate," Edron said, "with 30 of his people. He sent word ahead. No weapons. They want to enter publicly. To walk to the square through the city." He paused. "He said to tell you he's not hiding anymore." Vaelor understood what this was. Calum walking openly through the capital, through the streets of the empire that had erased his people, visibly, with his face uncovered, was not a tactical decision. It was a statement, not about the crown, about himself, about the choice to exist out loud in the place that had decided his existence was inconvenient. It was the bravest thing he'd heard in 30 days. "Open the gate," he said. He looked at Seraphine, who was in the corner of the room, and had heard everything, and was standing very still with the expression of a woman making peace with a feeling she'd been holding at arm's length. "Go," Vaelor said. "Walk with him." She looked at him. "The address?" "I'll wait," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she picked up her satchel and walked out, and Vaelor stood in the preparation room and listened to the city outside the window begin to register the presence of something unexpected moving through its streets. What happened next happened in the space between the southern gate and the council hall steps, and Vaelor was not there to see it, which meant he heard it afterward in pieces. From Edron, from the journalists who had been covering the address, from the members of Calum's network who described it in the careful language of people experiencing something they hadn't expected to feel. Calum Vael walked through the streets of Astrolith with 30 survivors of the Lumiborn communities and the other magical bloodlines his network had gathered, and the city watched. Not uniformly, not with one voice. Some people watched with the hard faces of people encountering something they'd decided to fear. Some watched with the cautious curiosity of people who had been told something was dangerous and were now doing their own assessment. Some, more than Vaelor would have predicted, more than Hale's version of the Empire would have allowed for, watched with expressions that suggested that what they were seeing was reaching something they hadn't expected to have reached. A city, like a person, is capable of more than its official positions imply. The official positions are the negotiated consensus of the loudest and most organized voices at any given moment. Underneath them is the messier, less articulable reality of individuals who are responding to what's actually in front of them. And what was in front of the people of Astrolith that afternoon was a man who had been told he didn't exist walking openly through their streets and looking back at them without flinching. Seraphine walked beside him. She did not hold his hand. He wasn't 6 anymore, and this wasn't that kind of reunion. She walked beside him as an equal, and between them was the specific quality of 2 people who had been severed and are now testing the reconnection, carefully, without assuming it will hold what it once held, but finding, with each step, that it holds something. The council hall steps held 300 people by the time Vaelor came out. He stood at the top of the steps, with the square below him and the crowd spreading back through the avenue, and he looked at the faces and felt the familiar gravity of the moment before a public act that cannot be undone. Calum Vael was at the edge of the crowd, not beside Vaelor, not performing unity, standing in the crowd, in the city that had tried to erase him, visible. Seraphine was at his shoulder. Vaelor looked at them once. Just once. Then he turned to the square and spoke. He spoke for 20 minutes. Not from a prepared text. He'd drafted one and set it aside because the drafted version was the managed version, the careful version, the version that could be edited and reviewed and approved. And this was not a moment for the managed version. He spoke from what he actually knew, which was what the documents said and what they meant, and what he intended to do about them. And he used his name and the crown's name and the empire's name. And he did not use the passive voice that politicians use when they want to acknowledge without claiming. Not mistakes were made, but choices were made, by people, named where he could name them, accountable to the record. The square was quiet while he spoke. Not the silence of acceptance, the silence of a large number of people doing something hard simultaneously, which was listening to a history they'd been handed as incomplete and being asked to hold the fuller version. When he finished, the doctrinal rescission document was brought out, and he signed it where every person in the square could see him sign it. And the council members who had voted for it came forward and signed it, and the record was made in the specific public way that makes things real. He looked at Calum across the square. Calum held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Not gratitude, acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a person witnessing a thing they'd spent years believing was impossible and revising that assessment in real time. It was not resolution. It was not the end of anything. The process would be long and contested, and there would be days in the next several years that felt like nothing had changed. The network's legitimate grievances didn't dissolve with a signed document. The damage done to 20 years of lives didn't reverse with a public address. The people who had lost the most would continue to carry what they'd lost, regardless of what the official record said. But the direction was different now. And the direction, in the long work of making something better from something broken, is the thing that matters more than any single moment. Vaelor was about to step back from the podium when the runner arrived. The runner came from the palace's eastern wing, one of the intelligence staff, and his face carried the expression that Vaelor had learned to recognize, the expression of someone bringing news that changes the category of what's currently happening. He leaned in and listened, and the thing he heard was this. 3 of Hale's former council allies had, in the hours while Vaelor was in the mountain pass returning from Alaris, made contact with the military commanders of 2 border territories, and those commanders, who had their own grievances and their own calculations, had been listening. And what they had heard was not Hale's arrest and formal charges as a warning. They had heard it as a signal. The signal that the center was weakening. The signal that the Empire's institutional order was fracturing from within. The signal that this was the moment, if a moment existed, to move. 2 border armies were 3 days' march from the capital. Vaelor stood on the steps of the council hall with the signed document still in the hands of the man who had carried it and the square full of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary, and he absorbed this information with the specific cold of a man who understands that he has just discovered the next problem is not behind him. It is ahead. 3 days. He looked at Seraphine across the square. She had seen his expression change. She was already reading it. He held her gaze, and in the hold was the compressed weight of everything. The 30 days behind them, the work they'd done, the cost that had been paid, and now this. The thing you don't get warned about until you've already spent everything you had getting here. 3 days. Vaelor stood on the council hall steps with the signed document still warm in the hands of the man beside him, and 300 people in the square below who did not yet know that the world had just changed category again. And he did the arithmetic in the space of 4 seconds. 2 border armies. Estimated combined strength from the intelligence, 14,000. His own capital garrison at full deployment, 9,000. The border commanders, Aldrich Wessin in the north and Commander Priasolt in the east, were not men he had misjudged. He had promoted both. He had trusted both. That trust now had the specific weight of a tool that had been handed back to him, sharpened on the wrong edge. He looked at Seraphine across the square, and he saw in her face that she had read his expression correctly and was already calculating alongside him. Then he looked at Calum. Calum was already moving toward him. The war room in the hour that followed held 8 people and the particular density of a meeting where everyone present understands that the window for decisions is narrow and the decisions themselves are permanent. Vaelor at the head of the table. Thorn, who had opposed him and been countermanded and had stayed anyway, because Aldrich Thorn's loyalty was ultimately to a structure larger than his own opinion, and Vaelor had always known this was true, even when it was inconvenient. Edrin. Maelis, who had been the first council member to stand and sign after Vaelor at the podium, which told him something he had filed away for later. 2 tactical analysts. Seraphine. And Calum Vael, sitting at a table in the palace war room of the Empire that had tried to erase him, because the situation had exceeded the categories they'd arrived in. 14,000 against 9, Thorn said. He was looking at the maps. His jaw was doing the grinding thing that meant he was angry and useful simultaneously. They have 3 days before they're in range of the capital's outer defenses, assuming standard march pace. They'll push faster, Maelis said. They know we know. Every hour they lose is an hour we use to close gaps. Can we close the gaps in 3 days? Vaelor said. Not with conventional deployment, Thorn said. We can fortify the northern approach, Solt's eastern column is the harder problem. The terrain opens up past the Draven River crossing, and there's no natural choke point. He looked at the map. We fight them both. We're spread thin enough that a coordinated push breaks through somewhere. So we don't fight them both, Vaelor said. Everyone looked at him. We split the problem, he said. Northern approach. Thorn takes the defense with full garrison support. Eastern approach. He looked at Calum. Your network. What's the terrain coverage east of the Draven crossing? Calum looked at the map. He had the specific quality of a man recalibrating the situation he'd walked into. This was not the conversation he'd expected to be having when he came to the capital for a public address, and the adjustment was visible in the careful economy of his expression. Then he leaned forward and pointed. 3 supply routes feeding Solt's column, he said. Here, and the river road. My people have been moving through that territory for 3 years. We know every waypoint. He looked at Vaelor. If you want the eastern column slowed, we can slow it. Not stopped? Not with the numbers available, but slowed enough to collapse the coordination. A 3-day synchronized push becomes a 5-day staggered one, Malus said. That changes the math significantly. It means your people are in direct contact with an Imperial column that's going to treat them as hostile combatants, Thorn said to Calum. His voice was careful and not unkind, which represented a significant evolution from the man who had stood in the corridor of the archive 6 weeks ago. I want to be clear about what I'm asking if the king asks it. I know what it means, Calum said. He looked at Vaelor. The people in my network, they didn't sign up to fight the Empire's civil war. No, Vaelor said. They signed up to protect their own survival, and their survival is directly threatened by 2 border commanders who are moving because they believe the Empire's institutional order is weakened enough to exploit. He looked at Calum directly. This isn't me asking you to fight for me. This is the situation asking everyone in this room to make a choice about what they're willing to do to protect what we built in the last 30 days. The archive, the rescission, the restitution processes. He paused. All of it is contingent on the capital holding. The war room was very quiet. Calum sat with his forearms on the table and looked at the maps and did his own arithmetic, and Vaelor watched him do it without rushing it, because this was not a decision you hurried a man through when you'd spent 30 days asking him to trust a process. My people don't take Imperial command, Calum said finally. No, Vaelor said. They operate independently. Their objectives are the supply routes, not direct engagement with the column. They make their own tactical calls. Agreed, Vaelor said. And when this is done, Calum said, the arrangement we discussed, the sanctuary, the restitution processes, the formal status of surviving bloodline communities, that gets written into law, not policy, law. I'll draft it tonight, Vaelor said. You'll have the draft before your people deploy. Calum looked at him for a long moment. The look had something in it that wasn't trust yet, precisely, but was the thing that trust grows from when it's been properly earned. The recognition that the person across from you has been consistent in the ways that actually matter. All right, Calum said. Thorn let out a breath that he'd been managing since the meeting started. Then we have work to do, Vaelor said. Seraphine found him after the war room cleared in the corridor outside, and she looked at him with the expression she used when she had something to say that she'd been deciding how to say. Calum, she said. Using the powers. He looked at her. The supply route disruption, she said carefully. If he uses conventional means, it's slower and the risk to his people is higher. If he uses the forbidden tier, I know, Vaelor said. Do you? She said. Because I need you to understand that what I said in the archive still holds. The corruption internalizes. Every use without containment is cumulative. She held his gaze. I can be there. With him. I can do what I do. Hold the boundary between what the power takes and what it leaves. But I can't do that from here. He understood immediately what she was saying and what it cost her to say it in this particular moment. She was saying she was going to be in the field with her brother, in direct proximity to 2 armies in motion, on the eastern approach where there was no cavalry over the ridgeline and no controlled environment. Seraphine, he said. Don't, she said quietly. Don't manage this one. I know what I'm doing. I know what it costs. I'm the only person with the technical capacity to contain what he'll access if he uses the high tier. And without containment, the operation is a liability rather than an asset. She held his gaze. This is my work. Let me do it. He looked at her for a long moment. The thing about the people who carry genuine capability, healers, tacticians, leaders, anyone who has developed a real skill at something that matters, is that they are never as safe as the people who love them would prefer. Their capability is the thing that puts them in the room, and the room is where the risk is, and trying to keep them out of the room to protect them from the risk is not protection. It is the subtraction of their agency in the name of your own comfort. Vaelor had learned this from governance, and from 11 years of watching capable people be underused by leaders who couldn't tolerate the anxiety of letting them operate at full capacity. He understood it now from a different angle. Stay in contact through Idrin's network, he said. If the situation changes, you pull back. If the situation changes, I'll use my own judgment, she said. Yes, he said. That's what I meant. She held his gaze for a moment, and something passed between them in the hold. Not the conversation they were going to have in 6 months, not the question he'd asked by the fire, but the foundation under both of those things, which was the specific reality of two people who had come from opposite sides of a very large wrong and found, in the working of it, that they trusted each other. Come back, he said. She looked at him. That's not a command. No, he said. It's not. She held his gaze one more time, and then she turned and walked back toward the archive to gather what she needed, and he stood in the corridor with the particular weight of a man watching someone he cannot follow go towards something he cannot control. The next 3 days were the kind that history books flatten into paragraphs. The reality was less clean, more exhausting, and more human than any compressed account could hold. Thorn defended the northern approach with 9,000 troops and terrain knowledge, and the specific competence of a general who had made peace with the fact that he was fighting to protect something his king had done that he still wasn't sure he agreed with, and who had decided to do it anyway because the alternative was worse, and because, somewhere in the 30 days, his assessment of Vaelor Draven had quietly revised itself in a direction he hadn't entirely expected. The northern column under Weesin pushed hard, and Thorn held, and the cost was real. Casualties on both sides, 3 defensive positions lost and retaken, 1 brutal night engagement near the river road where the fighting was close enough that rank stopped mattering, but the line held. The eastern column under Solt moved faster than projected, which meant Kalem's network was working at the edge of their capacity against a force that was better supplied and angrier than anticipated. The supply route disruption slowed the column, but didn't stop it. By the second day, the eastern approach was moving again. On the second night, Kalem accessed the high tier. Seraphine was there. She described it later in terms that Vaelor sat with for a long time. The specific quality of what her brother called up from whatever reservoir the forbidden powers drew from, the cold blue-white light that wasn't healing, the wave of it going into the supply column's forward position, and the sound it made, and the damage it did. And then Seraphine's own light against it, the warm, gold-threaded containment, pressing against the corruption's edges, holding the boundary between what the power took from the world and what it reached for next, holding the boundary between what the power took from her brother and what it reached for next. It cost her something. She was honest about that later, without drama. The specific cost of using healing energy as a counterweight to corruption, the exhaustion that was more than physical, the 2 days after where her hands didn't light up when she wanted them to, and she sat with that in the way of a healer who has given something that will take time to grow back. But the eastern column stopped, not from the disruption alone. Stopped because Solt, facing an obstacle he hadn't budgeted for and couldn't classify within his existing frameworks for what constituted a military threat, made the calculation that a 3-day synchronized push was no longer synchronized, and that an unsynchronized push into a fortified capital against a garrison that had successfully held the northern approach was a different operation entirely than what he'd agreed to undertake. He stopped the column 4 miles from the capital's eastern boundary. He sent a rider to Weesin. Weesin, who by that point was looking at a northern engagement that had not gone the way the intelligence had projected, and a southern flank that was exposed because Solt had not arrived to cover it as planned, made his own calculation. Both columns stood down on the morning of the third day. Itas. Vaelor received the formal surrender terms in the council chamber with Thorn beside him and the exhaustion of 3 days of managed crisis in every person in the room. And he accepted the terms with the specific flatness of a man who had won something he was not going to perform triumph about. Because performance of triumph over people who had just stood down was the thing that made future conflicts more likely rather than less. What he required was simple and specific. Formal acknowledgement under military record that the deployment had been unauthorized. Wasin and Solt removed from command pending review. The soldiers, most of whom had been following orders from commanders they'd had no reason to distrust, returned to their territories with no action taken against them, because soldiers are not the architects of the decisions that deploy them, and treating them as such was the specific category of institutional cruelty that the Empire's history had too much of already. Thorn disagreed with the last part. He argued for consequences down the chain. Vaelor listened to the argument fully, and then held his position, and Thorn went quiet in the way he went quiet when he disagreed and had decided to trust the disagreement to the record rather than escalate it. That was the right kind of disagreement, the kind that stayed inside the architecture. Calum came to the palace 3 days after the column stood down. He came alone, which was its own kind of statement. No flanking contacts, no organizational representation, just himself. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had used something large and was still feeling the edges of the space it had left. Seraphine was in the courtyard when he arrived. Vaelor watched them from the upper window because it was not his moment, this one, and he understood clearly enough which moments belonged to him and which didn't. They stood in the courtyard for a long time. He couldn't hear them from the window. He didn't need to. The quality of what was happening was visible in the set of their shoulders. The gradual release of something held a very long time, the specific quality of two people who have come to the end of a long road and discovered that the end looks nothing like what they imagined and is somehow still what they needed. At one point, Seraphine said something and Calum laughed. It was brief. It was real. And it was, Vaelor thought from the window, with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching something he helped make possible, the laugh of a person remembering that they had once been someone before the grief, and that person was not entirely gone. Quote, the law was drafted and ratified in the weeks that followed. The Sanctuary of Balance. Formal name, formal legal standing, formal land allocation on the eastern territory nearest Delaris, where the surviving Lumaborn communities had their deepest historical roots. The formal status of surviving magical bloodline communities as recognized peoples within the Empire, with the rights and protections that recognition carried. The restitution process formalized with actual timelines and actual mechanisms and an oversight body that included community representatives who were not advisory but voting. Calum Vael did not take a formal position within any of it. He remained what he had been, the organizing figure of a network that was now operating in daylight instead of shadow, building the infrastructure of something that wasn't a resistance movement anymore, but wasn't entirely comfortable being called anything else yet. He was in the process of becoming something. It didn't have a complete name. That seemed right. Seraphine built the sanctuary. Not metaphorically, she was on site, working with the architects, arguing about structural decisions with the specificity of someone who had been imagining this place since she was 8 years old and had very clear opinions about where the healing rooms should be and what the entrance should communicate to a person arriving in crisis about whether they were safe. She was not gentle with the architects. They said, after the first week, that she was the most demanding client they'd worked with and the building was going to be extraordinary. Vaelor visited once during the construction, ostensibly on a tour of the eastern territories that included the sanctuary site. He stood in the unfinished frame of the main hall with the walls still rough stone and the roof open to the sky, and Seraphine beside him showing him the layout with the focused energy of someone doing the most important work of their life. The light comes in here in the afternoon, she said, pointing up at the open roof. When the panels are in, they'll direct it south. Anyone in this room from midday to evening has light. You designed it around the light, he said. I designed everything around what it feels like to arrive here needing help, she said. Light matters. The difference between a room that communicates that you're being managed and a room that communicates that someone thought about what you'd need, that's the difference between healing and administration. She looked at the space. I know what it's like to need help and not find a room that felt safe. I'm not building that." He looked at the unfinished walls and the open sky and felt the particular quality of something being made that would outlast everyone in the room. "It's going to be extraordinary," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "The architects keep saying that. I'm starting to believe them." He looked at her in the afternoon light coming through the open roof, her hair carrying plaster dust she hadn't noticed, her expression carrying the open, unguarded quality of a person doing work they were born for, and he felt with clear, specific certainty the thing he'd been careful about naming for 30 days. He named it now, quietly, to himself. Then he set it in the correct place, which was not the middle of a construction site, but somewhere he'd return to when the moment was right. Asumgabe. 6 months later, the moment was right. The Sanctuary of Balance opened on a clear morning in early autumn when the eastern light came through the completed panels exactly as Seraphine had designed it, warm and specific, and the kind of light that a person in crisis would feel as an argument that the world contained warmth worth surviving toward. There were 200 people there, survivors of the Lumaborn communities, representatives of the other magical bloodlines Kalem's network had gathered, officials from the territories where restitution processes were underway, journalists, ordinary people from the capital who had heard about what was happening in the East and come to see for themselves whether it was real. Kalem stood at the entrance and greeted arrivals with the careful formality of a man who was still learning what it meant to be present in a public way, who was still deciding what his presence communicated and whether he could trust it to communicate the right things. He was doing something that Vaelor recognized as the early work of a person building a public self after years of building only a private one. It was slow. It was uncertain in the way of genuine things. It did not look like the biography version. It looked like a real person working in real time. Seraphine stood inside. She stood near the center of the main hall, where the light came down in the specific way she'd designed it, and she was talking to an elderly woman who had been the last elder of a surviving community from the Northern Territories, and their conversation had the quality of something long overdue. Two people who had each carried a piece of the same story and were finally in the same room where the pieces could find each other. Vaelor arrived at the sanctuary an hour after the opening, without ceremony, having sent Idron and his guard ahead so he could enter the building the way any person entered it, through the front, past the entrance that communicated safety, into the main hall with the afternoon light. He found Seraphine after the initial ceremonies had completed, when the hall had settled into the quieter work of a place beginning to be what it was built to be. She was in the smaller room off the main hall, the one she'd called the first room, the one designed specifically for people arriving in their worst state, with low furniture and no hard edges, and light at the height of a seated person rather than standing. She was sitting in one of the low chairs simply, not working, just sitting in the room she'd built, letting it be what it was. He came to the doorway and she looked up, and the expression on her face was the open, unguarded one, the one that didn't appear when she was managing anything, and it settled something in him that had been waiting for settlement. "You came," she said. "You built it," he said. She looked at the room. "I built it." He sat in the chair across from her, low, without hard edges, light at seated height, and they were quiet for a moment with the sanctuary around them and the sound of the main hall carrying through the wall, people and voices, and the beginning of the work this place was going to do for years. 6 months, she said. 6 months, he said. She looked at him with the specific quality of a woman who has been waiting to have a conversation and has decided that the waiting is finished. "Ask me again," she said. He looked at her in the light of the room she'd built and felt the particular weight of a person arriving, finally, at the thing they'd been moving toward through everything. The throne room and the archive and the mountain road and the fire in the pass and the 3 days of watching something he'd helped build nearly be taken apart. All of it resolving into this room, this light, this moment. "Is there room," he said, "for something that isn't the work?" She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. Not the provisional yes of 6 months ago, with its built-in distances and conditions. This was a different yes, the one that comes from a person who has had the time and the evidence and the space to decide what they want, and has decided. He reached across the space between the chairs, and she let him take her hand, which was warm and real and not lit up with anything except itself, And they stayed like that in the first room of the Sanctuary of Balance, while the world outside kept being the complicated, imperfect thing it was. This is the thing that gets lost in the stories about power and its recovery. The quiet middle of it. The stories want the dramatic arc, the rise and the fall and the redemption, and those things are real, they happened, they mattered. But between the arc and the end is the daily work. The long process of building something better from something broken, which is not dramatic and does not photograph well and cannot be compressed into a speech, but which is the actual substance of change. The sanctuary was real, the law was real, the restitution processes were real. They were also slow and contested and generated new conflicts as they resolved old ones, because that is what genuine change generates. Not smooth progress toward a clear destination, but the complicated friction of people who disagree about what better means, working inside structures that are trying to be different from what they've been. Vaelor Draven ruled for many years after, not without opposition, not without cost. There were council challenges and territorial disputes, and the ongoing work of institutional reformation that consumed more political capital than he had budgeted for and produced fewer clean victories than the work deserved. There were days when the right thing done badly looked like just damage with better intentions, which was the fear he'd named by the fire in the mountain pass. And those days were real, and he had to sit with them. But the direction held. Calum Vale became, over years, the kind of figure that history produces rarely. Someone who had been made into a weapon by what was done to him and had chosen, at the moment of maximum capacity for destruction, to put the weapon down. Not because the anger wasn't real, not because the grievance wasn't legitimate, because he had looked at his sister and at the king who had come to the ruins of a city his family had built, and had made the calculation that a future was worth more than a war, that the people attached to what he represented deserved a direction that didn't end in fire. He worked with the sanctuary for the rest of his life. He was not easy to work with. He brought his damage with him the way people do. And his damage expressed itself sometimes as demand, sometimes as withdrawal, sometimes as the cold blue-white light coming up in his hands during conflicts he felt too sharply before he could bring himself back. Seraphine was there for those moments, not as a manager or a keeper, as a sister, doing the specific work of witnessing a person's broken pieces without requiring that those pieces be hidden. That work was not glamorous. It was necessary. It was what love actually looked like when it wasn't a feeling but a practice, daily and ordinary and honest. What Seraphine built with the sanctuary was not perfect. Perfect was not available. What she built was real. A place that held people in the worst moments of their existence without requiring them to be better than they were. That provided the specific kind of care that acknowledged damage without making damage the definition of the person carrying it. In the years after its opening, several hundred people passed through the first room she had designed. Most of them went on to exist in the world in ways they hadn't been able to before. She counted that. She knew each name. On the highest balcony of the Imperial Palace, years later, Vaelor Draven stood in the early morning and looked at the city that had been his for 2 decades, and he was not alone. Seraphine stood beside him with her hands on the stone rail, and the light of the morning coming off the mountain range and the city below beginning to move into its day. All those fires and all those windows, the particular evidence of a city continuing to exist. "I've been thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said. "About what it means that we're still here," she said. "Both of us. Given everything that could have gone differently." She looked at the city. The archive release could have broken you. The council session could have gone the other way. The columns could have taken the capital. She paused. "Any one of those, and we're not standing here." "But here we are," he said. "Here we are," she said. "And I think about what that means. Not about luck. I don't mean luck. I mean the decisions." She looked at him sidelong. "Every decision that looked like the wrong one from the outside. Letting me into the archive, countermanding the column, going to Alaris without an army." She paused. "You made every wrong decision, and they were the right ones." "They were expensive," he said. "The right ones usually are," she said. He looked at the city and felt the accumulated weight of the years between the throne room and this balcony, all the decisions and their costs, the people and their complexity, the ongoing difficult work of trying to hold something together while making it different from what it had been. "Was it worth it?" he said. "Not a doubt. A genuine question, the kind you can only ask when you're far enough past the hardest part to see it clearly. She was quiet for a moment. "Ask me every year," she said. "So far, yes." He looked at her profile against the morning light, the city below them, the mountain range at the horizon holding the darkness of Alaris and the brightness of the sanctuary in the same range of peaks, and he understood with the specific clarity that only arrived at the end of long, hard work what the Empire had actually been built from. Not conquest, not strategy, not the instinct to dominate. It had been built, in the end, from this. From two people standing in the light of a city that had almost broken around them, choosing every morning to stay in the direction of what they'd decided was worth building. The strongest thing a person can do is not the thing they do when they're winning. It is the thing they do in the moment when all the structures they've built for protection have been stripped away and they're standing in the ruins of what they thought they were, and they have to decide, without the armor, who they actually want to be. Vaelor Draven had stood in those ruins. Seraphine Vael had stood in them longer. They had both looked at the wreckage and chosen, separately and then together, to build something from it that was more honest than what had stood before. That was not a story about strength in the way that strength was usually described. Not force, not dominance, not the iron certainty of someone who never doubted. It was strength in its actual form, which is the capacity to remain in difficulty long enough to understand it, and to let that understanding change you into someone better than the person who walked in. An empire may be forged by conquest, but the things that last are built from something harder to name and harder to sustain. From the willingness to look at what you inherited and call it what it is. From the willingness to stand in the ruins of what you thought was solid and ask whether what's underneath is worth keeping. From the specific courage of a person who, having every reason to stop, decides not to. Below them, the city moved through its morning 40,000 lives in 40,000 windows. Children who had been born into a world none of the people on this balcony had managed to hand them without cost, but a world that was, in the ways that mattered most, different from the one it had almost been. That was the victory. Not the crown, not the wars won, not the columns that had stood down or the signatures on documents that changed law. The victory was the hatred they had refused to inherit. The victory was the rooms Seraphine had built where a person could arrive in pieces and not be required to hide them. The victory was Calum Vael, who was alive, who was there, who had found a way to carry his damage without becoming it entirely. The victory was this morning, ordinary and real. Vaelor looked at Seraphine and she looked back at him, and between them was everything, the cost and the work and the years and the specific irreplaceable weight of having been changed by something together. And he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the morning hadn't already said. She reached over and put her hand on his. The city kept going below them. The empire kept being what they were trying to make it, and the day, like all days, asked only that they show up for it. They did.